Willow Creek Crossing, Texas. April 1878. A night the rain didn't ask permission. She hit the mud-hard valise, split open, her mother's handwritten pages drowning in a puddle, and the stagecoach rolled away without looking back. Then the stranger knelt down, not watching, not stepping aside. He dropped to one knee right there in the muck, stripped off his glove, and held out a bare hand toward her. And waited. Bernadette looked up, mud on her face, rain in her eyes, voice barely clearing the storm. "I came for you." This is the story of a woman learning to take up space, and the man who built the steps to help her do it. Start reading now and find out what he said. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight. Not the soft, polite kind of rain that made poets reach for their notebooks. This was a Texas downpour, loud and cold and indifferent, the kind that turned honest dirt roads into something resembling the bottom of a river. Willow Creek Crossing sat at the edge of nowhere, a stagecoach stop that amounted to little more than a wooden post, a rusted lantern hook, and a stretch of churned-up mud that sucked at a man's boots like it was trying to swallow him whole. Thatcher Vance stood beside his wagon and waited. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes. His hat brim had long since surrendered, water pouring off the front of it in a steady stream. His oilskin coat was doing its job, more or less, but his boots were soaked through, and his left leg was aching the way it always did in wet weather, a deep, grinding complaint from the bones that had been shattered at the siege of El Paso and put back together with field surgery and stubborn will. He leaned some of his weight against the wagon wheel without thinking about it, the way a man does when he's learned to manage pain quietly without making it anybody's business. He held the lantern up with his right hand. The flame inside it guttered against the glass every few seconds, but kept burning. He'd made sure the wick was trimmed right before he left the ranch. He'd made sure of a lot of things today. Clean sheets on the bed, a pot of pinto beans on the stove. The porch steps reinforced so they wouldn't creak and bow. He had not, however, prepared himself for the particular silence that came with standing in the rain, waiting for a woman you'd never met to step out of a stagecoach and decide whether the arrangement your dead friend had made for her was worth staying for. Thatcher stared down the road. There were no letters between them. Not really. There had been one, from her father Walter Higgins, a quiet, careful Boston man Thatcher had met only twice, years ago, through a mutual army contact. The letter had arrived 3 months back, sealed in wax, written in the neat hand of a man who knew his time was short. It had asked for something that went well beyond a simple favor, and Thatcher had sat with it for 2 weeks before he wrote back and said yes. He hadn't agreed because he was lonely, though he was. He hadn't agreed because the ranch needed a second pair of hands, though it did. He'd agreed because Walter Higgins had written please 4 times in 1 page, and a man didn't do that unless he was genuinely desperate and genuinely out of options. What Walter had told him about his daughter was plain and simple. She was intelligent. She was kind. She had worked as a library clerk for 4 years and could read in 3 languages. She had survived her mother's death at age 11, her father's long illness, and a lifetime of being treated by the public as something between a spectacle and an inconvenience. All because her body was large, had always been large, since she was a small child, due to something gone wrong in her blood chemistry that no doctor in Boston had been able to fix or fully explain. Walter had written that the cruelty she'd faced was not something she had ever deserved, and that she deserved, at minimum, a place where she could stand upright without someone laughing. Thatcher thought about that sentence a lot in the weeks that followed. At minimum, place where she could stand upright. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it. The crack of the driver's whip, the labored splash of hooves pushing through the muck, the groan of axles under strain. The coach came around the bend in the road, with its lamps swinging, and it pulled to a hard stop the post, the horses blowing steam into the cold, wet air. The driver didn't get down. He just pulled the door open from his seat with a long hook, called out something Thatcher couldn't hear over the rain, and waited. There was a pause. Then the door pushed open from the inside, and Bernadette Higgins appeared in the opening. She was holding a valise in one hand and the door frame in the other, and she was looking down at the wooden step below her, the way a person looks at something they don't trust. She was wearing a dark green traveling dress, soaked through at the shoulders, and a bonnet that had given up its shape to the weather entirely. She was a large woman. There was no pretending otherwise, no polite way to frame it large, in the way that had defined every room she'd ever walked into and every street she'd ever crossed, the thing that people saw first, and some people never stopped seeing. She got her right foot onto the step. The wood groaned. She adjusted her grip on the doorframe, shifted her weight, and started to bring her left foot down. The step gave way. It happened fast. 1 second she was on the step. The next she wasn't. Her foot went sideways as the wood cracked beneath her. The valise flew out of her hand, and she went down hard into the mud, landing on her side with a sound that was mostly impact and a little gasp. The valise hit the ground, and the latch snapped open. Papers exploded out of it, loose sheets covered in careful handwriting, manuscripts she'd worked on for years, poetry she'd copied by hand from library volumes she'd never owned, pages that scattered across the surface of the mud puddle like pale, drowning leaves. The stagecoach driver tossed her trunk down from the roof. It landed with a crash 2 feet from her head. Then he slapped the reins, and the coach lurched back into motion, wheels throwing a long arc of brown water across her wet skirts as it pulled away into the dark. She didn't move right away. She lay there in the mud with the rain coming down on her, and Thatcher watched her curl slightly inward, not in pain or not only in pain. It was the posture of someone bracing for the next blow. Someone who'd learned that when things went wrong in public, what usually followed was worse than the thing itself. Laughter, maybe. Commentary, the kind of remarks that people made while pretending they were only being honest. Thatcher set the lantern down on the wagon board and walked toward her. His left leg pulled at him with every step in the soft mud, but he kept his pace steady. He got to her and crouched down onto one knee right there in the muck, which soaked immediately through his trousers, and he pulled off his right glove, the thick leather work glove, and reached out with his bare hand. She flinched, not dramatically, just a small, reflexive tightening, the kind that lives in a person's muscles after years of things being thrown or said. He kept his hand where it was, open, steady waiting. She looked up. Her face was streaked with mud and rain, and, he suspected, tears, though the rain made it impossible to be certain. Her eyes were dark brown and very wide, and they searched his face with an expression he recognized not from any woman specifically, but from men he'd seen in the field, soldiers who'd been hit, and were waiting to understand how bad it was. He didn't give her a performance of reassurance. He didn't smile too big or speak too fast. He just held out his hand and let her decide. She took it. Her fingers were freezing. He felt them shake slightly as they closed around his palm, and he gripped back with care firm enough to be real. Not so tight, it was about force. He helped her sit up first, then got her to her feet in stages, one arm coming around her back to support the effort without rushing it. She was breathing hard when she was upright more. From fear and adrenaline than exertion, he thought. Her eyes went to her papers immediately, scattered across the puddle, some already going translucent from the water soaking through them. She made a sound, small, barely audible. He stepped around her without a word and started collecting the pages. He moved quickly, pulling them out of the mud with both hands, stacking them against his chest where the oilskin coat would give them at least some protection. Some were beyond saving the ink dissolved, the paper torn, but he got most of them. He brought them back and set them carefully into the open valise. Then he unclasped his oilskin coat, which left him in just his wool shirt, immediately soaked, and draped it around her shoulders. She stared at him. The coat was enormous on her, which meant it fit. It was heavy and warm from his body heat and smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and rain. He pulled the front edges together at her collar and then stepped back and just looked at her. His face calm. She was still shaking. The rain was loud around them, drumming on the wagon boards, hitting the mud in 1,000 small explosions of sound. His lantern swayed on its hook. There was nothing out here but the two of them, and the dark and the water coming down. He watched her face work through something, pride fighting with exhaustion, most likely. She'd traveled God knows how many days on that coach, from Boston to Texas, through towns that probably hadn't been kind to her either, carrying her valise full of poems and her father's desperate hope, and her own complicated feelings about all of it. And she'd arrived in the mud, at night, in the rain, in front of a man she'd never met. He thought about what Walter had said. At minimum, a place to stand upright. He could give her that much. He could start there. She looked up at him, then really looked, eyes meeting his, no longer scanning for the exit, and something in her expression cracked open, just slightly. Her chin trembled once. Her voice, when it came, was barely loud enough to clear the sound of the rain. "I came for you." 3 words. Exhausted and fierce at the same time somehow. Not a greeting. More like a declaration. Like she was telling him something important about herself, that she had done this deliberately, had crossed a continent and shown up in the mud by choice, that whatever had happened to her in the last 10 minutes or the last 26 years, she was still here, still standing, and she wanted him to understand that. He did understand it. He looked at her steadily and said, "You are a human being, Miss Higgins, not damaged freight. Out here, a person's worth isn't measured by the depth of their footprint in the mud." She blinked. He wasn't sure if anyone had ever said something like that to her plainly, without following it up with a condition or a qualification. He meant it without either. The world had a habit of talking about a person's worth like it was a thing to be earned back after some failing, like it could be gained and lost, depending on what you weighed or how you moved. He'd seen enough of the world to find that notion exhausting and stupid. Worth wasn't a prize. It was a starting condition. She pressed her lips together, hard, nodded once. He picked up her trunk, heavy, but he managed and carried it to the wagon, settling it in the bed with a careful hand. He came back for the valise, which she surrendered after a half-second hesitation. "Come on, then," he said. He offered his hand again for the step up to the wagon bench, and this time she took it without hesitating. She settled onto the bench, his coat still around her shoulders. He walked around to the other side, climbed up, and released the brake. The horses, patient old things, picked up their heads and started forward without being asked twice. They rode in silence for a while. The road back to the ranch was slow going in the mud, and Thatcher kept the horses to an easy pace, not wanting to risk a wheel in a rut. The lantern hung at the front of the wagon and threw a small circle of gold light ahead of them. Beyond that, everything was black and wet and indistinct. He was aware of her beside him. She sat straight, holding herself carefully, not letting herself lean on anything. She was watching the road ahead with the focused attention of someone who was working very hard to stay composed. He didn't try to fill the silence with talk. She didn't need a performance. She needed to breathe. After a long while, she said quietly, "My papers." Most of them came through. "All right," he said. "You'll want to lay them out flat to dry. They'll need time," she exhaled. "They were my mother's. I copied them out of books she loved. After she passed, she stopped. They matter to me." "I could tell," he said. "That's why I got them first." She looked at him from the corner of her eye. He kept his gaze on the road. Another stretch of silence. "I should tell you," she said, with the deliberateness of someone choosing honesty over comfort. "I'm aware of what I am, what I look like. I won't pretend it's easy to be around. Or that you aren't?" She paused, searching for the word. "Obligated in some way by my father's arrangement. I understand the nature of this. You can save that conversation for later, he said, or for never. Right now it's raining, and we're in the mud, and there's a warm cabin and a pot of beans on the stove. That's what matters tonight. She was quiet again. Beans, she said, finally, and he couldn't entirely tell if it was a question or just her trying the word out. Pinto, he confirmed, and cornbread if I pulled it off the heat in time. A pause, did you? Probably not, he said honestly. Something shifted in her breathing then. It wasn't quite a laugh, more like a laugh deciding at the last second not to commit. But it was something. He considered that a reasonable start. The ranch came into view, eventually the low shape of the cabin with its stone chimney. A thin ribbon of smoke leaning sideways in the wind from the damped-down stove, the outline of the barn dark against the darker sky. A single lamp burned in the cabin window, set there before he left so it wouldn't be dark when they arrived. He brought the wagon around to the porch and set the brake. She was looking at the cabin. He tried to see it through her eyes, small, certainly. Plain, but solid. The logs were good, and the chinking was tight. And the roof didn't leak, which was more than he could say for half the buildings in Sonora. He'd spent a month last fall on the roof just to be able to say that. It's not much, he said. It's dry, she said. Right now, that's considerable. He climbed down, went around to her side, and helped her down from the bench. Her feet landed in the mud with a squelch, and she caught herself, balanced, and stood. He took her trunk under one arm and her valise in the other hand, and went up the porch steps first, moving carefully on his bad leg. He got the door open and stepped back to let her go in ahead of him. She stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was warm, not lavishly, but genuinely, the heat of the stove reaching every corner of the single main room. There was a table near the window, a pair of chairs, a shelf of practical books, and one small shelf of less practical ones. A lantern on the hook by the door. On the table, the pot of beans still sitting on the iron trivet, a clean cloth laid out, a tin plate and a spoon set for one. He'd only set one place. He'd thought about it, decided it was more respectful. He'd eat later. She stood in the center of the room, his oilskin coat still draped around her, mud on her dress and her hands, and a streak of it drying on her cheek, and she looked around at the small, clean, honest cabin and breathed. He set her trunk by the bedroom door and her valise on the table. Bedroom's yours, he said. I'll take the lean-to. She turned. You'll freeze. I've slept in worse places in worse weather, he said, which was true. Blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. There's a wash basin on the stand, and I'll bring warm water from the stove in a minute. You should eat something. She looked at the table. At the single setting, her jaw tightened slightly. Go ahead and sit, he said, pulling the other chair back from the wall and settling into it himself, not at the table, just against the wall, like a man who happened to be in the room. Don't make it formal. Just eat. She sat. She ate. She didn't eat fast or greedily, or with any of the self-consciousness he might have expected. She ate the way someone eats when they've been hungry for a long time, and are trying to do it with dignity intact. He looked at the fire, mostly. He answered the two quiet questions she asked: how far to Sonora, whether the well water was reliable, and didn't push for conversation. After a while, she said, the cornbread was fine. He glanced at the pan on the stove. Pulled it in time, then. Barely, she said. But yes. He brought warm water in a pitcher and set it by the wash basin without ceremony. Got an extra blanket from the chest. Found the driest spots on her manuscript pages and laid them out flat along the window ledge to dry overnight, smoothing each one with a careful hand. She watched him do that from the table, her tin cup of water held in both hands. She didn't say anything. He didn't require her to. He built the fire up a little higher, checked the latch on the window, and got his coat off the peg by the door, the older one, the heavy wool, not the oilskin she was still wearing. He turned at the door. She was looking at him. Thank you, she said. Just that. He nodded once. Sleep well, Miss Higgins. He went out into the rain and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood on the porch for a moment, the cold hitting him right away, rain coming off the eaves in a steady curtain. His leg hurt. His shirt was still damp through. The lean-to off the side of the barn was going to be a cold night. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the mud, that voice. 3 words that had nothing small in them. I came for you. He pulled his collar up and walked out into the rain. Whatever this was, arrangement, obligation, something else entirely. Something he didn't have a name for, yet it had started now. She was here. She'd crossed the distance on purpose, shown up in the worst possible conditions, and chosen to stay standing. He could respect that. He thought, maybe he already did. She woke before dawn. Old habit. Back in Boston, the library opened at 7, and the walk from her boarding house took 40 minutes, which meant she was up at 5 regardless of weather or season, or how badly she'd slept the night before. Her body had simply decided that early rising was a permanent condition, and it enforced that decision without mercy. She lay still for a moment, blinking at the dark ceiling of the cabin bedroom. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was. The smell helped pine resin and wood smoke and something earthy and clean. Nothing like the damp wool and coal soot smell of her boarding house room in Boston. The mattress beneath her was thinner than what she was used to, but the sheets were fresh. She'd noticed that last night. Clean sheets. Someone had made the effort. Outside, the rain had stopped. She could hear the silence, where it had been the particular stillness that follows a long storm. When everything is soaked through, and nothing is moving, and the whole world seems to be catching its breath. A bird started up somewhere in the distance. Then another. She sat up carefully and reached for her traveling dress, still faintly damp and stiff, with dried mud at the hem. She had other clothes in her trunk, but she didn't want to waste good fabric on a morning she wasn't sure yet how to navigate. She dressed in the dark by feel, buttoned herself up to the collar, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, with her hands in her lap. She had arrived. She was here. The thought sat in her chest with a complicated weight. She'd spent the entire journey 4 days on the train, 2 days on the stage, the last leg an unspeakable slog through rain and bad road, rehearsing for an arrival that was supposed to happen in daylight, in front of a proper station, with time to compose herself and make a reasonable first impression. Instead, she'd gone down into the mud like a felled tree, scattered her mother's poems across a puddle, and arrived covered in filth, shaking from the cold, in front of a stranger who had every reason to look at her with disappointment. He hadn't. That fact was still sitting somewhere in the back of her mind, not quite processed. She was accustomed to a very specific sequence of events when strangers encountered her for the first time. There was almost always a pause, that small, involuntary hesitation where the eyes adjusted and recalibrated. Then a decision about what expression to wear. Usually the decision went one of 2 ways: forced cheerfulness that barely covered distaste, or no attempt to cover it at all. Thatcher Vance had done neither. He'd dropped to one knee in the mud and taken her hand with his bare palm. He'd collected her papers before he did anything else. He'd draped his coat over her shoulders in the rain and said something she was still turning over. You are a human being, Miss Higgins, not damaged freight. She'd heard kind words before. People said kind words sometimes, especially in polite Boston society, where cruelty was usually delivered with enough sugarcoating that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't cruelty at all. But that sentence had no coating on it. It was just flat and direct and stated like a fact, the same tone he'd used to tell her about the pinto beans. Like human dignity was simply obvious, like it required no special argument. She wasn't sure what to do with a man like that. She stood, smoothed her dress as best she could, and opened the bedroom door. The main room was empty, gray morning light coming through the window, the stove still holding a low warmth from the banked fire the night before. Her manuscript pages were still lined along the window ledge where he'd placed them. She crossed to them first and checked each one carefully, lifting the corners. They'd dried overnight, The ones that had absorbed the most water were wrinkled and stiff, the ink in places bleeding into soft illegibility, but the words were mostly there. She stacked them back in order with careful hands and returned them to her valise. She looked around the cabin. In the better light of morning, she could see it more clearly than she had the night before. Small, yes. One main room with the table and the two chairs and the stove and the shelf of books. A short counter along one wall with a wash basin and a water pitcher. A wooden peg rail by the door holding a battered hat and a length of rope. The floor was swept. The window was clean. The books on the less practical shelf were arranged by height, which told her something about a person, though she wasn't sure exactly what. She went to the stove and found it still had life in it. She added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside it and adjusted the damper until the fire picked up. Found a coffee pot on the counter and a tin of ground coffee beside it. Found water in the covered bucket near the door, fresh, clear drawn sometime yesterday. She set the coffee on to boil and looked for what else there was. Not much. Cornmeal, dried beans, a small crock of lard, 4 potatoes going slightly soft, a handful of dried herbs she couldn't immediately identify, half a tin of salt. She took inventory without judgment. This was a working man's kitchen, not a prosperous one. That was fine. She knew how to cook from scarcity. The boarding house years had taught her that much. She had the coffee ready and was working on a pan of fried potatoes when the cabin door opened and Thatcher came in from outside. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. He was wearing his work clothes, heavier canvas trousers, boots still damp flannel shirt, with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, despite the cold morning. He had a bucket of fresh milk in one hand from the looks of it, and a small bunch of early sage he must have pulled from somewhere on his way back. He looked at her, at his stove, with a carefully neutral expression. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She nodded at the coffee pot. "I hope that's all right. I found the tin." He set the bucket down near the counter. More than all right. He hung his hat on the peg and looked at the potatoes in the pan with something that might have been relief. "You didn't have to do that. I was up," she said simply, "and I know how to cook." He sat down at the table without ceremony and poured himself coffee. She plated the potatoes and set one plate in front of him and one at the other end of the table and sat down herself. She'd set 2 places this morning. It seemed strange to do otherwise. In daylight he looked at his plate, then at her. "Thank you, Miss Higgins," he said. "Etta," she said. "Please." "Miss Higgins makes me feel like I'm being called before the schoolmaster." A pause, then very slightly. "Etta." They ate. It was easier than dinner the night before. The morning light helped, she thought. Things were harder to hide from in daylight, but they were also harder to catastrophize. He ate steadily and without complaint, asked her once if the sage in the potatoes was her addition, and seemed genuinely pleased when she confirmed it. She asked him about the ranch, straightforwardly, as a practical matter, and he answered in the same spirit. 230 acres, he said. Rocky hill country. Not ideal for cattle in large numbers, but workable for a smaller herd, maybe 40 head. Good timber on the upper slopes. A creek that ran reliably 8 months of the year and trickled through the other 4. The barn needed a new roof on the east side. The south fence line was a month's work that he hadn't had time for. She listened and noted these facts the same way she used to catalog new acquisitions at the library, not performing interest, but actually having it. This was going to be her place too, presumably. It seemed reasonable to understand it. She did not ask about the financial arrangement. Not yet. That conversation existed somewhere ahead of her, and she could feel it the way you feel a coming storm. A change in pressure, a distant unease, but she wasn't ready to walk into it this morning. There was too much else to sort out first. After breakfast, he went back outside to start on the morning chores, and she washed the plates in the basin and dried them and set them back on the shelf. She swept the floor, though it hadn't needed much. She found a loose button on the curtain hem and repaired it with thread from her sewing kit. Small things. Useful things. She was aware, even as she did them, that she was working at a particular pace, a slightly urgent one. She'd been awake maybe 2 hours, and already she was filling the space, trying to demonstrate usefulness, trying to. She stopped herself and set the broom against the wall and stood very still in the center of the room. She was compensating. She recognized it because she'd done it her entire life. In Boston, it had taken a different form, arriving early, staying late, memorizing the location of every volume in the library so she could assist patrons without having to move through the stacks in front of them, making herself invaluable before anyone could make the case that she was inconvenient. Here, it would be cooking and cleaning and making herself small in every way, except the physical one she couldn't change. She was trying to earn her right to take up space. She knew it. She stood there and knew it and didn't move for a moment. Then she went outside. The morning had come in clear after last night's storm. The sky was that particular pale blue that showed up after heavy rain, almost too clean-looking, and the wet grass on the slope behind the cabin caught the early light and held it. She stood on the porch and breathed the air, which smelled of cedar and mud and something green she couldn't name, and she watched Thatcher cross the yard toward the barn with an easy, unhurried stride, his left leg giving that slight drag she'd noticed last night. She'd noticed a lot of things last night. She went back inside and, because she needed something to occupy her hands while her thoughts settled, she started reorganizing the pantry shelf. Not drastically. She didn't want to disrupt his system beyond recognition. But there was an order that made better practical sense than what was there, and she imposed it gently. That's how the first morning went. By the second day, she'd found the rhythm of the place. By the third, she was cooking 2 full meals, had identified which floorboards creaked and where to step to avoid them, had determined that the window on the north side let in a draft at night and could be blocked with a folded blanket. She was useful. She was contributing. The cabin was cleaner and better organized than it had been when she arrived. She was also eating almost nothing, not entirely nothing. She made sure to have something at breakfast when Thatcher was there because she didn't want him to notice and ask. But the midday meal she skipped entirely, and supper she kept to the smallest portion she could manage without it being conspicuous. She told herself it was sensible. The ranch's provisions weren't lavish, and she was an additional mouth, a large one. It made sense to be conservative. She told herself this with great sincerity and did not examine it too closely. On the fourth evening, Thatcher came in from the barn as she was setting supper on the table. He washed up at the basin, dried his hands, and looked at the table. Then he looked at her plate. She'd given him a full serving of the salt pork and beans she'd made. Hers held maybe a third of that. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat down. She sat down. He looked at his plate, and then he looked at her plate again, and then he looked at her. "You've been doing that," he said. She kept her eyes on her food. "Doing what?" "Eating less than half of what you cook." His voice was even, no accusation in it, but no room for evasion either. "And at noon you don't eat at all." "I've noticed," she said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine." He set his fork down. "I asked, well, I told you what I noticed." She arranged her fork alongside her plate. She had a prepared response for this. She'd used it in various forms throughout her life, a polite deflection about small appetites and personal preference that most people accepted because they were relieved not to have to press further. She started to say it. Then she stopped. Thatcher was watching her with the same steady patience he'd had in the mud that first night, and she understood suddenly that he wasn't going to accept the deflection. Not because he was aggressive about it, but because he was genuinely paying attention. And genuine attention was surprisingly hard to misdirect. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, not quite meeting his eyes, "I'm not trying to be a burden." "On the provisions." "The provisions," he repeated. "We have a limited supply, and She stopped. "I take up a great deal of space as it is. The least I can do is..." "Etta." His voice was quiet, but it cut through cleanly. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, not pity, which she would have bristled at, and not the exaggerated concern of someone performing sympathy. Something more plain than either of those. Food is strength to build a life. You don't ever have to starve yourself to apologize to the world for existing. The words landed with a precision that surprised her. She sat very still. He picked up his fork again, filled her plate from the pot, without asking, and set it back in front of her. He said nothing further on the subject. He picked up the conversation from where it had been before supper, asking about the book she'd been reading that afternoon, and he waited for her to answer. She answered. She ate her supper, all of it. She lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, turning that sentence over and over. You don't ever have to starve yourself to apologize to the world for existing. It was not the first time in her life someone had told her to eat. People told her to eat all the time. Usually with elaborate winks and social implications she was supposed to find amusing. This was not that. This was a man telling her plainly that she was allowed to need sustenance. That needing things was not a debt. She wasn't sure she'd ever believed that. She was starting to think she might need to reconsider. The next morning she made a full breakfast for both of them and ate every bite of hers. She met Gideon Sterling at the end of that first week. She'd seen him from a distance, a tall, broad-shouldered man, working in the yard, moving with the efficient economy of someone who had been doing physical work his whole life. Thatcher mentioned him once, briefly. Gideon Sterling, free man, skilled carpenter, and general hand, worked the ranch with him for the past 2 years. Said it without annotation or explanation, the same tone he used to describe the south fence or the creek. A fact about the place. When they were formally introduced, Gideon removed his hat and nodded, and she nodded back. And that was sufficient. She watched how they worked together over the following days. There was no performance of command on Thatcher's end, no deliberate display of equality for her benefit either. They simply worked alongside each other, argued over the right approach to the east roof repair with the frank ease of two people who had settled the question of mutual respect long ago, and moved on to more interesting disputes. At midday, they sat on the fence rail together and ate and talked, and sometimes didn't talk at all. A few days later, she found young Toby Baker sitting behind the rain barrel at the corner of the barn. She'd come around the corner looking for the spare handle for the water bucket and almost walked into him. He was perhaps 9 years old, thin in the way of children who don't get enough of anything, and he looked up at her with enormous brown eyes and didn't make a sound. She'd been told about him by one of the women she'd briefly encountered during a trip to the edge of the property line, a mute boy, orphaned, taken in loosely by the town but not really belonging to anyone, sometimes found wandering near the ranches on the outskirts. She'd filed it away as local information and thought nothing more of it. Looking at him now, she thought considerably more. She sat down on the upturned crate nearby, not rushing anything, not making a production of it. She just sat down, giving him the choice of whether to stay or go. He stayed. She pulled the small notebook from her apron pocket. She'd started carrying one, finding it useful for inventory and observations, and opened it to a clean page. She drew a quick sketch of the water bucket. Then she looked at him and pointed to it, then made a questioning gesture, her palm up. He watched her. She drew a handle on the bucket. Then she drew an arrow pointing toward the barn. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile yet, but attention, active attention, the kind that meant a mind was engaged. He stood up and led her to the barn's back corner where the spare handle was hanging on a nail, precisely where she'd been told to look. She found it right where he showed her. She held it up, nodded at him, and said, "Thank you." He didn't respond verbally, but he didn't leave either. She went back to the crate and sat down again. She tore a clean page from the notebook, held it out to him. She found the small charcoal stick she kept in her apron for marking supply sacks and held that out too. He took them. He stood there for a moment, looking at the blank paper. Then he sat down in the dirt, and he drew a horse. Simple lines, but recognizable. The legs slightly too long, and the head slightly too large, the tail a rough curve. He held it up at her. She looked at it seriously, the way she'd learned to look at things when she meant it. "That's good," she said. "That's a very good horse." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned the paper over and waited. She thought for a second, then took the charcoal and wrote, carefully, and large horse. She pointed to the word then, to his drawing. He studied it. She pointed to each letter separately. H, O, R, S, E, said each one aloud. He touched. The H, then O, then, looked up at her. She nodded. He looked back at the paper and traced the letters with his fingertip. This, she understood, was the beginning of something. That afternoon, she mentioned it to Thatcher while they were eating supper. She said it carefully, not asking permission exactly, but presenting it as a thing she intended to continue and wanted him to know about. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The town doesn't pay him much mind." "I know," she said, "but he's clearly intelligent. He just needs a different approach." Thatcher looked at her across the table for a moment. "Whatever you need for it. Tell me. Paper? Chalk? Whatever," she said. "Thank you." He went back to eating. Later that night, she was in the bedroom reading when she heard sounds from the porch. Small, careful sounds, the particular sound of someone trying to work, quietly and mostly succeeding. She set her book down and listened. A rhythmic scraping, low and methodical, then a tapping, the sounds of a man doing carpentry. She considered going to look, decided against it. He clearly didn't want to make anything of it, whatever he was doing, or he'd have done it in daylight. She went back to her book. In the morning she found it. She'd come out onto the porch to shake out the rag rug, and she saw the chair first, because it was sitting in the morning light near the breakfast table, a little apart from the others. It was wider than the existing chairs, not dramatically, but significantly, and built lower at the seat with a broader back and a reinforced crossbar at the base. The joints were tight, the sanding thorough, the wood the same pine as the table. Someone had fitted it with care. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the porch steps. They were new, too, or not entirely new, the same steps, but resecured. The boards replaced where they'd begun to soften, the edge joints reinforced with iron brackets she hadn't noticed before. She pressed her foot down on the top step. It didn't move. It didn't groan. It was solid and certain and built to hold. Thatcher was already outside when she came off the porch, moving toward the barn. She stood by the steps for a moment. He didn't look back. She understood then that he wasn't going to say anything about it. He had no intention of presenting it to her, making a moment of it, waiting for her thanks. He'd built what needed to be built and done it quietly, because the point wasn't the gesture. The point was the result. Steps that held, a chair that fit. She thought about the night she'd arrived, the way he'd collected her papers first. She went inside and started the breakfast fire. That afternoon, she took her primer out to the porch and called to Toby, who she'd seen hanging around near the rain barrel again. She settled in the new chair, which fit exactly as it needed to, and spread the primer on her knee. Toby came and sat on the step beside her, and she opened to the first page. Gideon came around the side of the cabin about an hour into their lesson, carrying 2 fence posts and a mallet. He saw them on the porch and slowed without stopping. He watched for a moment the large woman in the wide chair and the silent boy bent over the book, her finger moving under each letter, his face tipped up toward her, and then back down to the page with intense concentration. Gideon set his fence posts down. He stood there in the yard and watched for long enough that Thatcher came around the other side of the cabin and found him standing still. Thatcher looked at what Gideon was looking at. He stood there, too, for a moment. He'd seen a lot of things in his life, war and bad country, and men choosing the wrong thing with full knowledge of what they were choosing. He didn't count blessings as a habit, because it had always seemed like a way of not paying attention to reality. But he looked at that porch, at the two quiet figures bent over their letters in the afternoon light, and he felt something he would have had difficulty naming. Something that had less to do with the arrangement and more to do with the particular feeling of watching someone be exactly the person they actually were. Etta's voice floated across the yard. B says ba, like barn. Toby's thin finger traced the letter on the page. Gideon picked his fence posts back up and moved on. He said nothing. Thatcher went back to what he'd been doing. Inside the cabin, the wide chair sat at the table, solid and sure, built for a person who had every right to sit in it. The porch steps didn't creak. The second week settled into its own quiet order. Etta had expected the strangeness of the situation to persist longer than it did. She'd prepared herself, during the long days on the stagecoach, for an extended period of awkwardness, two strangers moving around each other in a small space, every conversation deliberate and careful, every shared meal a minor negotiation. She'd lived enough of her life in rooms where she wasn't entirely welcome to know what that particular tension felt like, that low-grade discomfort that never quite went away, no matter how much time passed. It wasn't like that here. It wasn't comfortable in the way that familiarity is comfortable. They were still strangers in the ways that mattered, still learning each other's rhythms and silences. But the discomfort that did exist was ordinary, the kind that came from two people navigating a shared space, not from one person being unwanted in it. She noticed the difference. It was not a small thing. She'd claimed the morning hours for housekeeping and cooking, the late mornings for her own reading, and the afternoons increasingly for Toby. This last part hadn't been planned exactly. It had arrived the same way a lot of things arrived, by small accumulation. First one afternoon on the porch with the primer, then the next, then the one after that. By the start of the second week, it had become the fixed point around which the rest of her day arranged itself. Toby came every afternoon without being asked. She'd wondered, at first, whether he'd continue. Children who'd been ignored long enough sometimes stopped expecting anything to continue, stopped investing before the disappointment had a chance to arrive. But he showed up at the rail fence at roughly the same time each afternoon and waited, and she brought the primer and her notebook and the charcoal sticks, and they sat together under the shelter of the porch roof and worked. She'd been a library clerk, not a teacher. She had no formal training in instruction of any kind, let alone instruction for a child who communicated without speech. But she had 4 years of watching people learn, watching which approaches worked and which made a person's eyes go flat with frustration. And she had her own memory of learning to read, which had been a private and intensely felt experience, nothing like the rote drilling she'd seen in school primers. So she didn't drill. She started from what he already knew, which was more than people probably assumed. He could recognize numbers. He understood cause and effect. With remarkable clarity, she'd confirmed this the second day, when she drew a sequence of 4 small pictures in her notebook and scrambled them, and he put them back in order without any hesitation, including correcting her ambiguous third drawing with a skeptical look that made her laugh. He was observant in the particular way of children who'd spent a lot of time being overlooked, which meant he caught things that most people walked right past. She built the letters from what he knew. She connected each one to something concrete he could see or touch. The letter B to the barn, the letter C to the creek. She drew pictures beside each letter, and beside each picture, she wrote the word, and she let him trace the letters with his finger before he tried to write them himself. She never rushed the tracing stage. Rushing it was the fastest way to make a person feel stupid, and she had no interest in making Toby feel anything of the sort. By the 5th session, he could write his own name. She'd written it for him first, Toby, in careful block letters across the top of a fresh page. She showed it to him, pointed to him, pointed to the letters, his name. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took the charcoal and, with enormous care, copied it below hers. The letters were uneven, the B slightly backwards, but they were legible, and they were deliberate, and they were his. She said, "That's your name, Toby, in your own hand." He looked at the page. Then he looked at her. His expression was the most complex thing she'd seen on his face, yet not exactly happiness, though there was something in that direction. More like the particular feeling of a door that's been locked a long time opening. She understood that feeling intimately. She let the moment be what it was without adding to it, and they moved on. Gideon Sterling witnessed most of these sessions. He wasn't watching with any particular intention. His work simply brought him around to the south side of the cabin in the afternoons, where the porch faced, and he was constitutionally incapable of moving inefficiently, which meant he didn't take detours. He had a fence section to repost along the south line, and that work put him within clear sight of the porch regularly enough that watching the lessons became an accidental habit. He said almost nothing about it to Etta directly in those early days. He was a quiet man by nature and by long practice, and he'd learned over the course of his life that the wisest response to a thing worth respecting was usually to simply let it happen without loading it down with commentary. But on the sixth day of lessons, when she and Toby were working on the letter M, and the boy made the connection between the letter and the word mother, and went very still for a long moment before writing the letter 3 times in a row, with quiet ferocity, Gideon set down the fence post he was carrying and stood in the yard for a full minute saying nothing. Then he picked it back up and went on with his work. That evening at supper, he said to Thatcher they ate together when the day's work was finished, the 3 of them, or sometimes just 2, depending on what needed doing. The boys coming along. Thatcher looked up from his beans. "I can see it." "She's got patience," Gideon said. He said it in the tone of someone making a professional assessment. He was a man who worked in wood, and he valued craft, and what Etta was doing on that porch had craft in it. Thatcher nodded once and went back to his supper. Etta was still in the cabin when they had this exchange, washing up the cooking pot at the basin. She couldn't hear the words clearly through the open window, only the low murmur of voices and the scrape of chairs on the porch. She wasn't listening for it. She was thinking about the letter M and the way Toby had gone still when he'd made the connection, and whether she should bring that up gently or leave it entirely. Alone. She decided to leave it alone. Some things a person needed to work through, without anyone naming them. The question of what Toby needed outside of his lessons had been occupying her more broadly. He was, as far as she could determine, genuinely alone in a way that went beyond his silence. The town of Sonora was not cruel to him exactly. Not that she had direct evidence of yet. She hadn't been into town, but from what Thatcher mentioned in passing, the boy was simply not seen. Ignored by the schoolteacher, because the school had no approach for a child who couldn't speak. Taken in at the boarding house where the proprietor let him sleep in the storage room and fed him irregularly. Nobody responsible for him in any sustained way. She'd experienced her own version of that invisible life. Not the same, she understood the differences clearly, but she knew what it meant to be physically present in a community that had collectively decided to look slightly to the left of you when you came into view. To be there, but not there. To take up space without being acknowledged as someone who occupied it. She found it intolerable on his behalf, in a way she'd never been able to find it intolerable on her own behalf. That, too, was something she was beginning to examine. On the 9th day of her first 2 weeks, she followed the sound of hammering to the far side of the barn and found Gideon repairing the east-facing wall with a series of new planks, fitting them into the existing structure with the precision of a man who genuinely loved his work. She stood watching for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He didn't stop working. "Go ahead. How long has Toby been in town?" Gideon thought about it, set one plank and reached for the next. Coming up on 3 years, he was brought in by a circuit rider who found him on the road outside San Angelo. No family that anyone could find. No papers, she said. And the school. School teacher's a decent enough woman, Gideon said. But she's got 30 children in one room and no experience with a child who doesn't speak. She doesn't know what to do with him, so she doesn't do anything. He said this without bitterness, as a plain description of a practical problem. People generally don't do the thing they can't figure out how to do. No, Etta agreed. They don't. Gideon fit the new plank and tested it with his palm, applying pressure along the length. It held. He moved to the next gap in the wall. You've figured it out, though, she said. I'm working on it. He glanced at her sideways. Working on it looks like fluency to me. She considered that. I had practice, I suppose, translating for people at the library. When someone couldn't find the words for what they needed, you learn to work with what they gave you, instead of waiting for the words. Gideon said nothing to that, but he nodded once in a way that meant he was filing it. They stood in companionable, quiet for a while, him working and her leaning against the barn wall with her arms crossed, watching the craft of it. She had a genuine admiration for people who were good with their hands. Her own hands were good for pen and needle, and the arrangement of small objects, which was a different kind of skill, but a recognizable cousin to what he was doing. She said, You've been with Thatcher 2 years. Came through in the spring of '76, he said. Had been working timber up near Dallas. Heard there was ranch work available and came south. He's a fair employer? Gideon paused very slightly before answering. Not from hesitation, she sensed, but from choosing the right word. He doesn't think in terms of above and below, he said finally. Some men, white men, they have the right intention, but they can't stop thinking in that direction. Every kindness they extend comes packaged up with the fact of the extending. You understand what I mean. She did, the gesture calling attention to itself. That's it. He tapped a nail into place with 3 clean strokes. Thatcher just works alongside you. Disagrees with you when he disagrees. Expects you to pull your weight and pulls his own. Eats at the same table and doesn't make it a statement when he does it. She looked toward the cabin, though she couldn't see it from here. He eats at the same table with you, she said. Every evening. Every evening, Gideon confirmed. Winter, too, when it would be considerably more comfortable to ask me to eat in the barn and not have to carry the extra wood for the stove. He didn't say this with particular warmth or gratitude, just fact. I've been in other situations where that wasn't the case. She thought about what he hadn't said as much as what he had. Thatcher had mentioned once a neighboring rancher named Orson Finch. In the context of the south fence line, something about a property boundary dispute that had been going on for years. He hadn't elaborated, but she'd caught the particular flatness in his voice. When he said the name, the specific vocal quality of a man keeping his opinion contained, because he'd learned that voicing it served no purpose. She said, What about Finch's operation? Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. Not dramatically. Finch has 8 men working his ranch. All of them freedmen. They eat outside, back of the main building, on the ground. He doesn't provide equipment for the work. They use their own tools, or they do without. He pays late when he pays at all. He set the last plank in place. He's also been trying to get Thatcher's land for 3 years, because the creek that runs through this property feeds his southern pasture, and he wants it gone from the calculation. She absorbed this. He sounds like a dangerous man, she said. Dangerous men generally do sound like something else until you've watched them operate long enough. Gideon picked up his toolkit and gave the repaired wall a final, assessing look. He sounds mostly like a very wealthy one, which in this county is practically the same thing. She thought about her father's advice, repeated many times in her childhood, Etta. The powerful will always use whatever tool is at hand. Your job is to make sure the truth is also at hand. She missed him with a sharp, sudden clarity, she said. Thank you for talking with me. Gideon picked up his toolkit. You ask straight questions, he said. Easy to answer those. He went around the side of the barn, and she stood for a moment in the morning light, thinking. That afternoon's lesson was the best they'd had yet. The rain had come back in the morning, not the heavy storm of her arrival, but a steady, persistent gray drizzle that turned the yard to mud again and ran off the porch roof in thin streams. She'd brought the oil lamp out to the porch and hung it on the hook, and in its warm circle of light, she and Toby spread their materials across the porch boards and settled in. She'd brought something new today. She'd stayed up the previous night hand-drawing a set of picture cards, small, simple images on squares of stiff paper cut from the back of a writing tablet. A horse, a barn, a tree, a dog, a house, a man, a woman, a child. Each image drawn with care and labeled below in block letters. She laid them out on the boards between them. Toby looked at the array of cards with intense focus. He picked up the one with the horse and compared the drawing to the letters below it. H-O-R-S-E. She'd taught him all 5 letters individually in the past week. He'd seen the word as a word once before. She watched him look at the letters and could almost see the moment they resolved when they stopped being 5 separate marks and became a single unit of meaning. He looked up at her. She nodded. He set the card down and picked up the one with the barn. B, she'd taught him B, first connected to the barn, A-R-N. He got to the N and paused, and she pointed to the north fence post, visible from the porch, and said, North. N says, N. He looked at the fence post and then back at the N and traced it with his finger, she said. N says, N. Like night, like November, like now. He traced it again, looked at the word as a whole, set it down, and picked up another card. They went through all 12 cards. Some he connected quickly. Some he needed longer. She let him need longer without stepping in. Patience was the whole of it. She'd realized not a strategy exactly, just the simple commitment to sitting with a person in their process without trying to accelerate it for your own comfort. When they finished the cards, she gave him the charcoal and a fresh page. Write me the thing you want to tell me most, she said. Any way you can. He thought for a long time. Then he drew a small picture. A woman sitting at a table reading, a boy sitting beside her. Both figures surrounded by what she recognized, after a moment, as her picture cards arranged around them in a circle. Beneath the drawing, with enormous concentration, he wrote, Toby is here. She looked at it for a long time. 3 words, subject, verb, location, and every letter correct. She said carefully, Yes, you are? She didn't add anything. She let the sentence be sufficient, the way it deserved to be. He tore the page from the notebook and held it out to her. She took it, folded it carefully, and put it in her apron pocket where she kept the things that mattered. The rain came down steadily off the porch roof, and the lamp burned its warm gold in the gray afternoon. And neither of them spoke, one, because she was holding very still. So she didn't cry in front of a 9-year-old, and the other because he never spoke, and hadn't needed to today. Thatcher came in from the upper field as the afternoon light was beginning to shift, riding the bay horse he used for the longer distances when his leg was tired. He saw the porch from across the yard, the lamp, the 2 figures, the scattered papers and cards across the porch boards. He slowed the horse without thinking about it. They were bent over something new. The boy was writing. Actually writing, not tracing, his hand moving with the beginning of intention, forming shapes on the paper, checking them against the cards laid out beside him. Etta was watching with her hands folded in her lap, entirely still. The specific stillness of someone who is paying full attention and knows that speaking would cost something. Thatcher sat on the horse for a moment longer than was necessary. He'd built the chair for her without thinking about whether he'd tell her about it, and he'd reinforced the steps because they needed reinforcing, and her safety was a practical matter, and neither of those things had felt like particularly large gestures at the time. They'd felt like things that needed doing. Watching her on that porch, he thought about what Gideon had said that morning. She's got patience. It was true, and it was also not quite the right word. Patience implied endurance, waiting something out. What Etta had with that boy was more active than patience. She was building something, deliberately, from available materials, with craft and intention. He took the horse to the barn and unsaddled him, and went through the evening chores with his mind only partly on the work. At supper, the three of them were at the table, Thatcher, Etta, and Gideon, who stayed some evenings when the work had run long, and it didn't make sense to walk the mile back to the small house he rented at the edge of the Vance property. Etta served the meal and sat down, and Thatcher poured coffee for all three of them, and they ate. Gideon said to Etta, directly, which was his way, "The boy wrote his name today." She looked up. "You saw that?" "I see most of what happens on this property," he said, not unkindly. "Comes from working outside," she said. "He did more than that today. He wrote a full sentence." Thatcher looked at her. "What sentence?" She was quiet for a second. Then, "Toby is here." Nobody said anything for a moment. Gideon drank his coffee. Thatcher said, "First time he's written anything?" "First time he's had the means to," Etta said. "He's been communicating perfectly well for his whole life. He just needed tools the rest of us recognize." Thatcher thought about that. "He'll need somewhere to keep learning. Past what a porch primer can give him." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it. The school teacher, in town, is doing her best in an impossible situation and doesn't have the background to do differently," Etta said, not harshly. "I'm not criticizing her. But Toby needs specific instruction, and he needs continuity, and he needs to not be in a room with 30 other children who have been told, even if nobody said it out loud, that he's less than they are because he doesn't speak." Gideon looked at Thatcher. Thatcher looked at Etta. "What are you thinking?" She set her fork down. She'd clearly been thinking it through for a while, because she said it without hesitation. "A proper space. Not just the porch. The porch works for now, but it won't work in the winter. Somewhere dedicated. Light enough to read by. Big enough for more than one child, because Toby isn't the only child in this county who's fallen through the gaps," Thatcher said. "A schoolhouse. Eventually," she said. "I'm not asking for everything at once. I'm telling you what the goal is." He nodded slowly. Gideon said, "To the middle of the table, rather than to either of them, I can build." Both of them looked at him. He shrugged slightly, a movement that contained its own full paragraph of meaning. "That's what I do. Give me the materials and a plan, and I'll build whatever structure you have in mind." He looked at Etta. "You tell me the size and the windows, and I'll tell you what it needs." She looked at him for a moment, then at Thatcher. Thatcher said, "We'd need to talk about where to source the lumber, and it won't happen fast." "I'm not in a hurry," Etta said. "Toby's been waiting his whole life. A few more months won't harm him if I'm here in the meantime." The words settled over the table, "if I'm here," with a significance nobody addressed directly, which was the appropriate way to handle them. After supper, when Gideon had gone and the dishes were washed, Etta sat at the table with her notebook open and began sketching a rough floor plan. A single room, she wrote, south-facing windows for the light. A door wide enough for a child on crutches or with a wheeled chair. A wall of shelving for books when there were books to put on it. She sketched the desk arrangements. Enough space between them that children could spread materials without crowding. She thought about what Gideon had said. All children regardless. She hadn't said that exactly, but she'd been thinking it. She wrote it at the top of the page. Open to all children. No exceptions for race, speech, body, or means. She looked at it for a moment. Then she drew a small star next to it, her library notation for something important, and closed the notebook. Outside, the rain had stopped again. Through the window, she could see the edge of the property, where the lamp in Gideon's distant window made a small warm point of light in the dark. Tomorrow, he'd be back at the south fence line. Tomorrow, Toby would come at his usual time, and they'd move on to words with 2 syllables, which she'd been planning all week. She thought about what Gideon had said about Orson Finch. his workers eating on the ground. Paid late when paid at all. The creek. The boundary dispute. She thought about Thatcher setting 3 cups of coffee at a table without making a statement of it. Just doing it because it was the right way to do things, because a shared meal was a human thing, regardless of who was sitting at it, and treating it as otherwise was simply beneath him. She'd spent 26 years watching people decide which other people counted. Here, the decision seemed to have already been made. She thought maybe that was the thing, not a gesture, not a performance, but a decision already so thoroughly settled that nobody needed to announce it anymore. Thatcher didn't eat with Gideon to prove something. He did it because excluding a man from your table, because of his skin, was not something a person of actual moral character did, full stop, and he'd made that determination at some point and never revisited it. She respected that more than she had words for. She folded her arms on the table and rested her head on them for a moment. Closing her eyes, she was tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that came from a day where things had been built, even if the things were made only of letters and paper, and the first sentences of a small boy who had been waiting for someone to hand him the tools. Toby is here. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the folded page, smoothed it on the table in front of her, looked at the 2 figures in the drawing, the woman reading the boy beside her, the picture cards arranged around them like a border. She stayed like that for a while, the lamp burning low, the Texas night settling quiet around the cabin, and she did not feel, for the first time in a very long time, like she was taking up too much space. She felt, very simply, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The morning Thatcher announced they were going into town. Etta was at the stove turning cornbread out of the cast-iron pan, and she went still for just a second before she turned around. "When?" she said. "After breakfast." He poured coffee and sat down. "Need to pick up feed at Calloway's, and I told you we'd get fabric for a proper dress. The one you've been wearing is done in." She looked down at herself. He wasn't wrong. The green traveling dress had survived the mud of her arrival, and 3 weeks of ranch work, but the hem was fraying where she'd caught it on the fence post. The left sleeve had a mend that was starting to pull, and the color had washed out in patches. She'd been nursing it along because the alternatives in her trunk were things she'd packed for a life she wasn't living yet: a Sunday dress too impractical for daily work, a cotton day dress that had already been let out twice and fit awkwardly through the shoulders. "All right," she said. She put the cornbread on the table and sat down. She ate her full portion without thinking about it, which was new enough that she noticed it. 3 weeks ago, she'd been calculating every bite against some invisible ledger of what she was owed. Now she just ate breakfast. Small progress. She'd take it. Thatcher hitched the wagon after the morning chores. Gideon was out at the south fence and gave them a wave as they pulled out of the yard. Toby was not around, yet he usually arrived in the afternoon, and she found herself making a mental note of things she wanted to bring back for their lessons. Chalk, if the general store carried it. A harder pencil than the charcoal sticks. Paper that could hold up to repeated erasing. The road into Sonora took 40 minutes in good weather. They'd had 3 dry days running, which meant the road had firmed up enough that the wagon moved without fighting the mud at every rut. The hill country opened up around them as they rode cedar and live oak on the slopes, the creek glinting in the low valley to their right, the sky a particular hard blue that meant heat later in the afternoon. She watched it all and said very little. Thatcher didn't push. He'd told her once, in passing, that silence was something he'd learned to respect in people, that a man who'd spent enough time in the field learned quick that not every quiet needed filling. She appreciated that more than she'd said. She was thinking about the town. She had done this before. Arrived somewhere new, walked into a general store, or a post office, or a church social and felt the room recalibrate, the eyes moving to her, the slight pause in whatever conversation had been happening. Then, the decision, each person making their individual choice about whether to be polite, pointed, or simply to look through her like she was a smudge on the window glass. She'd been through it so many times that she'd developed a kind of armor for it. Not hardness exactly, more like a practiced neutrality, a way of moving through a space at a steady pace without letting her face show what it cost her. She wasn't sure that armor was still intact. 3 weeks on the ranch had done something to it. Thatcher treating her like a person every single day, in the plain and unremarkable way of someone who simply found it obvious it had shifted something, made the armor looser, and a looser armor was a more dangerous one. She straightened her back against the wagon seat. She was here, she'd stay standing. Sonora was a small town, but it had the confidence of a larger one. The main street ran 8 blocks, with a post office, a barber, 2 saloons, a church at the far end, and a string of storefronts between them: general store, feed merchant, the telegraph office, a milliner's shop, a dressmaker's, a land office with Orson Finch's name on the sign in large gilded letters. She took that in as they passed, said nothing. Thatcher pulled the wagon in front of Calloway's feed and tied the horses to the post. He came around to her side and offered his hand for the step down. She took it, landed steadily, and released it. She stood on the boardwalk and looked down the street. It was mid-morning, and the street had its regular crowd. Women with baskets moving between the stores, men loading wagons or standing outside the barber in a loose cluster. A few children chasing something between the buildings that she couldn't see. The ordinary noise of a working town on a dry Tuesday. She was aware, in the way she was always aware, of the distance between herself and the nearest person. Not afraid of it, just aware. Thatcher said, "Feed first, then the dry goods for the dress fabric. Calloway's will have the chalk, too, probably." All right. They went into Calloway's together. The man behind the counter, presumably Calloway, a broad, red-faced man with flour dust on his apron, looked up when they came in, registered Thatcher, and then registered her. There was the pause. Etta cataloged it without expression and moved her attention to the wall of shelves behind the counter. The feed business was conducted quickly. Thatcher knew what he needed, and so did Calloway, and they moved through it with the ease of an established commercial relationship. She stood to one side and looked at the chalk display near the window, found a box of proper white chalk sticks, the kind schoolchildren used, added a package of loosed paper, unlined, thick enough to hold up to charcoal, and pencil both. When she set them on the counter, Calloway looked at the items and then at her. "You a teacher?" he said. "Working toward it," she said. He looked like he didn't know what to do with that, so he added it to the tally and said nothing further. They loaded the feed into the wagon and walked the 2 blocks down to the dry goods store. This was where it started. The store was a proper dry goods establishment, not large but well-stocked, with bolts of fabric on a long table against the left wall, and shelving of notions, buttons, ribbons, and thread covering most of the right. 2 women were already in the store when they came in, one at the fabric table with a bolt of blue calico spread before her, the other near the notions shelf. Behind the counter, a young woman who was probably the shopkeeper's daughter looked up with a polite expression. The polite expression lasted exactly as long as it took her eyes to travel from Thatcher to Etta. Etta walked to the fabric table and began looking through the bolts. She was looking for something practical: cotton or wool blend, a weight that would hold up to outdoor work but breathe enough for the Texas spring. Darker colors that wouldn't show the dirt. She found a dark brown cotton that felt reasonable and pulled the bolt a few inches to check the weave. Behind her she could hear the 2 women. They were not speaking to each other. They were speaking at a volume and angle that was meant to be overheard. "Is that her?" the first one said. "The bride he sent away for." The second one made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound. "I heard she came all the way from Boston." A pause. "Boston must be running low." Etta did not turn around. She looked at the fabric in her hand. The weave was even. The weight was right. Lord have mercy, the first one said quietly, and then a sound that was not quite laughter. Almost laughter. The kind that was supposed to pass as a cough. Thatcher had moved to the other end of the fabric table to look at a heavier canvas, and she could see from his posture that he'd heard it too. He didn't react visibly. She knew him well enough by now to read the stillness that meant he was choosing his response. She set the brown cotton bolt aside and pulled out a dark blue wool blend. Check that too. The shopkeeper's daughter came over to her side. "Can I help you find something?" She was trying. Etta could see that the girl was 18, maybe, and doing her professional best to look as though everything was normal, and she had not heard the two women, and was not currently wishing she was somewhere else. "I need something for everyday wear," Etta said, kept her voice level. "Work appropriate. Dark color. I'm looking at this wool blend and the brown cotton. Do you have anything in between those weights?" The girl showed her a dark gray cotton twill that was in fact exactly right. They discussed yardage. Etta had been sewing her own clothes since she was 14, had to, given the difficulty of finding ready-made garments in her size, and she knew what she needed and could calculate the yardage without help. The girl seemed surprised and then pleased by this, and they settled into a practical conversation about thread weight and needle size that had nothing to do with anyone else in the room. The first woman had gone quiet when the shopkeeper's daughter appeared. Now she started again. "I saw him at the crossing 3 weeks back," she said to the second woman, still in that not-quite whisper, "standing in the rain with that lantern. Poor man, what a desperate thing to resort to." The second one murmured agreement. "A mail-order bride is one thing," the first said, "but that—" Etta placed her hands flat on the fabric table. The twill was smooth under her palms. She looked at the bolt. She breathed out slowly through her nose. She was familiar with this. She knew the architecture of it, the way this particular form of cruelty worked, the way it wrapped itself in the language of pity and observation, so that the person doing it could maintain, even to themselves, that they were only being honest about what they saw. She'd been hearing some version of it her entire adult life. She knew what it cost to respond and what it cost not to. She was deciding which cost she could afford today. She'd decided and was about to pay her chosen price, which was silence and the dignity of ignoring it entirely, when the door of the shop opened. She knew who it was before she turned around. She didn't know his face or his name yet, not with certainty, but she'd learned to recognize a particular quality of entry. The kind of man who walks into a room and immediately measures how much of it is his. The pause at the door is not hesitation. It's assessment. Orson Finch was perhaps 50, heavyset in the way of a man who had been strong once and was now simply large, wearing a coat that had been expensive when it was made and hadn't been forgotten about since. He had a thick, neatly barbered mustache and small eyes that moved quickly around the room before settling. They settled on her. His face did something, not the involuntary flinch of someone surprised, more considered than that. A slow reassessment, like he was deciding something. "Vance," he said. Not a greeting, just an identification. Thatcher turned from the far end of the table. His expression was completely neutral. Finch. Finch walked into the room. He moved with the ease of someone accustomed to owning most of the spaces he occupied. He looked at the fabric on the table in front of Etta, then he looked at her, and then he looked at Thatcher with a slow, deliberate expression. "So this is what came off the stage," he said. Nobody spoke. Finch clasped his hands behind his back and rocked slightly on his heels. "I'll say this for you, Vance. You've got a certain fearlessness when it comes to lost causes." He looked at Etta again, a long, measuring look with something undisguised in it. Contempt, mostly, though wrapped in the performed amusement of a man who found his own cruelty entertaining. Though I'd say the term mail-order bride applies loosely here. Boston elephant, I'd call it. Or he looked at Thatcher with an expression that could have passed for sympathy in bad light. "Well, Desperate enough to claim a haul of livestock, I suppose. The shop went completely still. The two women by the notion's shelf said nothing. The shopkeeper's daughter had gone the color of chalk. Etta felt the words hit, felt them the way you feel a cold thing, sudden and all at once, and did not move. Thatcher stepped forward. He moved around the end of the table and stepped between Finch and Etta, and he didn't rush it. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had made a decision and wasn't second-guessing it, and he stopped when he was close enough that Finch had to look up at him slightly. He looked at Finch for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, clearly and without heat, "A person's dignity resides in their mind and heart, Finch. Not on a scale, and certainly not in the narrow minds of men who hide their moral poverty behind a bank book." The room was absolutely silent. Finch's face went through something. His jaw set. A flush moved up his neck that he controlled before it reached his face. His eyes, which had been amused, were not amused anymore. He looked at Thatcher. Then he looked at Etta, over Thatcher's shoulder, and the look was still contemptuous. But there was something new in it, not chastened. Not quite. More like a man who has been told the game is more expensive than he thought and is deciding whether the price is still worth it. He said to Thatcher, "You'll come to your senses eventually." His voice was level, deliberate. They all do. He turned and walked back out of the store, and the door closed behind him. The shop stayed quiet for another moment. Then the first woman near the notion's shelf began gathering her things with very studied concentration, and the second one looked at a button display as though she'd never found anything so fascinating. And the shopkeeper's daughter let out a slow breath that she'd probably been holding for 30 seconds. Thatcher turned around. He looked at Etta. She was still standing at the fabric table, with her hands flat against the dark gray twill. She was very still. Her face was, she didn't know what her face was. She could feel it from the inside, and she couldn't read it, which meant she had no idea what it looked like from the outside. He reached across the table and picked up the gray twill. He carried it to the counter without saying anything and set it down. 4 yards of this, he said to the shopkeeper's daughter, "and whatever notions she needs." The girl nodded and started measuring. Etta moved to the counter. She picked out the thread. She found the right needle size. She paid attention to what she was doing, because paying attention to what her hands were doing was something she could manage, and the alternative was not managing it. She was 26 years old. She had been called things in various polite and impolite forms that she would not have been able to count if she'd tried to. She'd been stared at in theaters and on train cars and in church. She'd been the subject of the kind of whispered conversations that were not quite quiet enough in libraries and boarding houses and public gardens and dry goods stores, exactly like this one. She was not unfamiliar with Orson Finch. She had met many Orson Finches. They had different faces and different names and different parts of the country behind them, and they always had the same essential structure. But nobody had ever stepped in front of one of them for her before. Not once. Not in 26 years. She had walked out of every room alone. She had absorbed every comment alone. She had decided, again and again, that showing how much it cost her would only give it more power, and so she'd become very good at not showing it, and she'd done that alone too. Thatcher had not asked her permission. He'd just moved. He'd stepped forward and put himself between her and the ugliness and said something clean and factual, and left no room for performance on either side. She paid for the fabric and thread and put the package under her arm. She walked out of the store with him and stood on the boardwalk in the mid-morning sun and let the air hit her face. He stood beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking down the street, and his expression was still that particular settled stillness. Not angry, exactly. Past anger, more like. The kind of feeling that comes when something confirms what you already knew, and you're working out what to do about the knowledge. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her. Then, "Don't thank me for that." "I beg your pardon?" "What I said in there." He stopped. "Tried again." That was just the truth. I don't need thanks for saying the truth. She looked at him. He was not being modest. He was being literal. He genuinely seemed to feel that speaking plainly in defense of something plainly real was not a notable act. She thought about what Gideon had said. He doesn't think in terms of above and below. All right, she said. I won't thank you. He nodded once and started walking. She walked beside him. They went the length of the main street toward the post office, and she was aware of the looks, some openly curious, some quickly averted, some landing on her with the specific weight of an assessment being completed. She kept her pace steady. She looked where she was going. She did not make herself smaller than she was. At the post office, there was a letter waiting, forwarded from Boston, through a contact of her father's illegal document she'd been waiting on. Something to do with the closing of the estate. She tucked it into her bag without opening it. She'd read it tonight. Outside the post office, Thatcher stopped to speak with a man. She didn't recognize something about the south fence line, a boundary marker that needed to be reestablished. She stood a few feet away and watched the street. She saw the two women from the dry goods store emerge from a shop across the way. They saw her. One of them looked quickly in the other direction. The other held her gaze for a second too long, and then looked away too. Etta stood where she was. She didn't look away first. Something small had changed. She wasn't sure either of those women could identify exactly what it was, and she wasn't sure she could either. But she'd stood on this street in front of Orson Finch's contempt, and she hadn't moved, and Thatcher had stepped in front of it, not with anger, but with something steadier than anger, something that had the quality of an absolute conviction held so long it no longer required announcement. And the world had not ended. Finch had turned and left. The street was still there. She was still there. The sun was still doing its work. She breathed. On the way back, the wagon rolling out of town into the open country, Thatcher said, "He's been trying to take the ranch for 3 years." She waited. Started with an offer on the land. I said no. Then he filed a dispute over the creek boundary, claimed the headwaters were on his property and the water rights followed. He kept his eyes on the road. That got settled in my favor by the county surveyor. But Finch disputed the survey. That's still pending, technically. Gideon told me some of it, she said. The dispute. His workers. Thatcher glanced at her. His workers. The way he treats them. The pay. She paused. The ground. He looked back at the road. His jaw worked once. There's not a lot I can do about what happens on his property. I can do something about what happens on mine. The table, she said. He said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his version of yes. She looked at the passing countryside, the cedar on the hillsides, the long grass coming up green in the low spots after the rain, a hawk turning slow circles above the ridge. He'll come back, she said. Men like Finch don't change course because someone says something true to them in a dry goods store. No, Thatcher agreed. They don't. What does he want? Specifically, the creek. If he controls the water on the south end of this property, my south pasture is useless, can't graze without water, which means I'd need to sell, eventually, or watch the herd drop to nothing, and then he buys the land, at whatever price he sets. She thought about that for a mile or so. He has the county land office, she said. I saw the sign. He has the land office and the bank, Thatcher said. The circuit judge comes through twice a year. Finch usually has a letter waiting when he does. She said, does the judge read them? Reads them. Gets taken to dinner at Finch's house. Rides out again. She was quiet. My father worked in a bank, she said, finally. Thatcher glanced at her. For 20 years, she said. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was a very precise one. He knew how banking law worked, how loan documents worked, how a foreclosure had to be conducted, what a bank was legally required to disclose and what it wasn't. He taught me some of it. She looked at the road. Not all, but some. Thatcher didn't say anything for a moment. Then, why are you telling me this? She turned to look at him. Because I think you should know what I bring to this arrangement, beyond cooking and fabric selection. He held her gaze for a second. Then he looked back at the road, and she saw something at the edge of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to recognize. "I'd already worked that out," he said. "Somewhat. And? And I'm not opposed to knowing more." She faced forward. "Good." They rode in silence for a while, and it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd ridden out in. Less careful, more like the silence between two people who have established something and don't need to keep establishing it. When the ranch came into view, the cabin on the low ridge, the barn, Gideon's figure moving along the south fence line, the whole ordinary small landscape of a life being built, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief. She'd felt relief before, and it was a smaller thing. This was something that settled rather than released. Something that said, "Here, this place." She carried the fabric into the cabin and set it on the table. She opened the legal letter. She read it twice, standing at the table, before she understood what it said. Then she read it a third time to make sure she hadn't misread. She set it down carefully. She stood there for a long moment, with her hands at her sides, looking at the paper and thinking about her father, his neat handwriting, his careful voice, the way he'd always said what he meant plainly, and without dramatics, even when what he meant was very large. Outside, she could hear Thatcher at the water pump, the familiar sound of the handle, the rush and splash of water. She had questions now that she hadn't had this morning. Important ones. Questions that were going to need to be asked carefully. But not today. Today, she folded the letter and put it in the lockbox at the bottom of her trunk, and she went to the door and stood in the afternoon light, and she watched the ordinary shape of the afternoon unfold, Gideon coming up from the south field, Thatcher moving from the pump to the barn, a cloud moving across the ridge and then past it. Toby appeared at the fence rail at his usual time. He saw her and came across the yard and sat down on the porch step and looked at her expectantly. She went inside and got the chalk and the picture cards and the notebook, and she came back out and sat in her chair and put the materials between them. And she said, "All right, where were we?" He pointed to the card with the two-syllable word on it. "River." She nodded. "River, R-I-V-E-R, 2 beats. River." She tapped the table twice. He tapped twice. She said, "Good." Again. He tapped again. Behind her, through the open door, the cabin was warm, and the letter was in the box, and the gray twill was on the table, waiting to be cut and sewn into something that fit her properly. And down the road, 2 miles, the land office sign with its gilded letters was probably catching the afternoon sun. She'd think about all of that later. Right now, there was a boy learning the rhythm of a word. That seemed like the right place to put her attention. The spring storms came in from the southwest that year with a particular bad temper. Etta had been in Texas long enough by then to understand that the weather here didn't negotiate. Back in Boston, a storm announced itself. It built gradually over the harbor, gave you an afternoon of darkening sky and rising wind to prepare yourself, arrived on something like a schedule. Texas storms were different animals entirely. They came up fast out of nowhere and hit hard and personal, and the sky would go from clear blue to a sickly green-yellow in the time it took to walk from the barn to the cabin. She'd watched 3 of them roll through in the 5 weeks since her arrival. Each one had a different character. The first was all lightning and little rain sheets of electric light pulsing across the ridge for 2 hours straight while the ground stayed dry and the cattle bunched together in the low field and didn't know what to do with themselves. The second had dropped 2 inches in 40 minutes and turned the yard into a shallow lake. The third had brought hail the size of marbles that punched holes in the kitchen garden and left dents in the wagon's wooden sideboards. She was developing a respect for them. She was also developing an ability to read the sky that she hadn't had before. Thatcher had pointed some of it out, without quite turning it into a lesson, a comment here, an observation there, delivered in the same matter-of-fact way he said most things. Greenish light means rotation somewhere. A still warm afternoon in spring is more suspicious than a cloudy one. When the birds go quiet, pay attention. She'd filed all of it. The day the barn caught fire started as the warmest day they'd had yet. The second week of May, and the temperature had climbed into the high 80s by noon, which felt savage after the cold wet of April. The air had a charged, breathless quality to it that she'd started to recognize. Too still, too warm. The kind of afternoon that was waiting for permission to do something. Gideon had gone into Sonora that morning on an errand something to do with sourcing additional lumber for the schoolhouse project, which had moved from concept to active planning over the past 2 weeks. Toby had come for his lesson early, which he sometimes did when the weather made him restless, and they'd worked through a full set of 3-syllable words and a short reading passage she'd written out herself, simple enough for where he was, but with enough new vocabulary to push him. He'd read the entire passage aloud, silently, his lips moving, which was his version of reading aloud, and at the end he'd looked up at her with an expression of satisfaction, so complete it was almost funny. She'd sent him home around 2 o'clock when the clouds started building to the southwest. Thatcher was in the barn. He'd been working on the saddle rigging for the better part of the day, and she knew he'd moved on to the hay storage in the late afternoon, moving the older bales to the front to be used first, stacking the newer ones in the back. Necessary work. She'd heard him moving back and forth with the cart. She was at the cabin table, cutting the gray twill when the first crack of thunder rolled across the valley. It was close. Closer than the sound usually arrived. She'd learned that thunder in hill country could travel deceptively, bouncing off the ridges, so that a storm far away would sound nearby, and a close one could sound like it was on top of you without warning. She set her scissors down and went to the window. The sky to the southwest was a deep, bruised purple, moving fast. Not the sickly green of a rotation storm, just a hard, fast-moving thunderstorm, the kind that would be on them in 20 minutes. Lightning was flashing inside the clouds already, illuminating them from behind like lanterns. She crossed to the cabin door and looked out. The yard was still. Not a breath of air. The horses were moving in the paddock, restless, circling the fence in that tight, unhappy way they had when weather was coming. She looked at the barn. The barn door was open. Warm light from the lantern. Thatcher had hung inside. Earlier was visible through the gap. She could hear the wind picking up in the cedars on the ridge, that first rushing sound that meant the front edge of the storm was arriving. She went back in and put her scissors away, covered the fabric with a cloth to keep it clean, and moved the water buckets to the counter. She filled the large kettle and set it on the stove. Practical preparations. She went through them quickly. The thunder came again. Harder this time, and this time the lightning came with it, a white crack that split the sky almost directly overhead and lit the window in a flash. So sudden she blinked. The horses screamed. That was the only word for it. Not the restless noise of horses anticipating a storm. An actual scream, high and panicked, from both animals at once. She was out the cabin door before she'd made the decision to move. She ran across the yard toward the paddock, her mind already on the horses, on getting them inside, or at least settled, and then she smelled it, sharp and acrid and hot, cutting through the smell of rain. Smoke. She stopped. She turned. The left wall of the barn, the older timber section, was lit. Not engulfed, not yet. A section near the high window, maybe 8 feet up, where the lightning had struck the dry timber. It was burning with a focused, determined intensity, the way old dry wood burns, and even as she watched it, a gust of wind pushed through the open barn door, and the flames leaned hard and reached for the nearest loose hay. The hay caught. She ran. She hit the barn door and shoved it all the way open, and the smoke hit her immediately, thick and fast-moving, the kind that gets into your eyes and throat before your brain has time to register it's happening. She pulled her apron up over her nose and went in. Thatcher. No answer. The smoke was already substantial inside. The burning section was the upper left, but the flames were moving along the hay scattered on the floor, spreading in a low racing line toward the stacked bales on the far right side. The lantern Thatcher had hung near the back wall was still burning ridiculous and irrelevant detail. Her mind clocked it anyway. Thatcher. She heard it then. Not a voice. A sound. Something between a grunt and a sharp exhaled breath, coming from the far side of the stacked bales. She went around the first stack. He was on the floor. A beam had come down, one of the lateral cross beams from the loft framework. Old timber, dry as the wall that was burning. It had come down and landed across his lower legs, and it was not a small beam. 12 inches across at least, maybe 8 feet long. The full weight of it pinning him from the knees down. He'd gotten one hand braced on the floor and was pushing himself upright, trying to get leverage on the beam with his other arm, but the angle was wrong, and the beam was too heavy, and his bad leg was trapped in a way that wasn't giving him anything to push from. His face, when she came around the bale, and he saw her, cycled through about 4 things: very fast relief, and then alarm, and then the specific alarm of a man who does not want the woman he is responsible for to be inside a burning building on his account. "Get out," he said. She was already moving toward the beam. Edit. "Stop talking." She dropped to her knees beside the beam and got her hands under the near end. She assessed it the way she'd assessed things her whole life, when she needed to move them, not the weight itself, but the physics of the weight, where the mass was distributed, where the best leverage point was. The beam was resting at a slight angle, which meant the near end carried less than the far, which meant the near end was where to start. She set her hands, she breathed, she lifted. She had never in her life been grateful for her size, not once, not sincerely, not in the way that reached all the way down to the actual belief of it. She'd been told, occasionally, and with the condescension of people trying to be kind, that her body had strengths she didn't appreciate. She'd filed that away with the other things people said that were meant to help and didn't. This was not an act of theory. She was here, in this burning barn, with her hands under this beam, and she was lifting it. It moved. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It moved the way very heavy things move when something strong enough is applied to them, slowly, grudgingly, a few inches at first. Enough. She held it there, the muscles in her arms and shoulders, and back taking the load, and she said through clenched teeth, "Now, pull yourself back." He pulled. She felt the resistance change as his legs cleared the beam. She held it until she was certain, and then she set it back down, and her arms were shaking, and she was breathing hard, and the smoke was getting worse by the second. He was already getting up, or trying to. The bad leg was compromised. She could see that immediately. The angle of it wrong. He'd been rolled by the weight of the beam, and something in the ankle had given. He got his good leg under him and pushed to standing, and grabbed the top of the bale for balance, and she got to him and put her shoulder under his arm without discussing it. They moved. The hay on the floor was burning in 3 separate lines now. The left wall was fully engaged, and the heat coming off it was extraordinary, the kind that presses against your skin like a physical thing. The smoke was thick enough that she was navigating more by memory of the barn's layout than by sight. The door was straight ahead, and to the right she knew that. She'd been through this barn 100 times. She kept moving. He kept pace with her, his arm across her shoulders, taking as much of his own weight as he could manage. His breathing was sharp and shallow. Pain. She catalogued it and kept walking. The near bale stack went up behind them. The fire found it, and the sound it made was a deep, rushing roar that pushed a wall of heat across the back of her neck. She didn't look back. She pushed through the barn door. The rain hit them immediately. It had arrived in the last few minutes, a hard, driving rain. Exactly the kind that came with this kind of storm. Cold and direct, and completely without mercy, which in this particular moment was a mercy. She pulled him further from the door, out into the yard, away from the burning building, and they stopped about 30 feet out. He was leaning on her, heavily now. She held him. The barn burned. The rain was doing some work against it. She could see the left wall's upper section steaming, where the water hit, but the interior was already too far gone. The roof on the east end was catching now, the old shingles going up fast. She didn't look at Thatcher's face right away. She was looking at the barn. Then she looked. He was looking at her, not at the barn, not at his burning property, the months of work it represented, the feed they'd stored, the tools hanging on the walls. He was looking at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before and couldn't entirely interpret, because it was too many things at once. He was covered in smoke. There was a burn mark on his left forearm where something had caught him, a raw, bright stripe across the skin. His face was soot-streaked, and his hair was wet from the rain, and he was standing on one foot with the other barely touching the ground, and he was looking at her. She said, "Your ankle, Etta. Sit down. The ground is wet, but it doesn't matter. Sit down." He sat. She went down with him, or beside him, the rain coming down on both of them, and she got her hands on the ankle with as much care as she could manage. He didn't make a sound while she examined it, which was its own kind of information. Either it was not as bad as it looked, or he had a higher pain tolerance than almost anyone she'd met, and based on 5 weeks of observation, she suspected the second. The ankle was fractured. She was not a doctor. She had been very clear with herself about the limits of what she knew, but she'd studied basic field medicine from a book in the library that she'd read twice because it interested her, and fractured was the word for what she felt under her hands. Not compound. The bone wasn't displaced, but fractured, she said. "I need to get you inside. The horses are out of the paddock and running up the ridge, and they will survive." She looked at him steadily. "You need to come inside." He looked at the barn. The east roof was gone now. The rain was fighting the fire and losing the upper half of that battle, but winning the lower one, and the yard itself was damp enough that it wasn't going to spread to the cabin. She'd already checked that calculation. "Come on," she said. She got him up again, and they crossed the yard through the rain, and she got him through the cabin door, and to the chair, not the special wide one he'd built for her, the other one, the straight-backed one, and sat him down. She moved fast after that. Water from the kettle, still warm, clean cloth from the shelf. The wooden box she'd put together in her second week, quietly and without announcement, from things she'd found in the cabin, and a few things she'd brought herself from Boston, a needle, gut thread, salve she'd bought in Sonora, bandaging linen, a small glass bottle of carbolic solution she'd been carrying since she read about field sanitation 3 years ago, and decided it was the sort of thing a sensible person kept on hand. She cleaned his arm first. The burn was serious, long and raw and painful to look at, and she heard his breath catch when the carbolic hit it. She said, "I know. Hold still." She said it the same way she said everything when she was focused, factual. Not unkind, just direct. She dressed the burn and moved to the ankle. This part was harder. She'd splinted injuries in theory, but not in practice, and she did not have proper splints, which meant improvising from what was in the cabin. 2 strips of hardwood from the shelf trim she pried off carefully, 2 lengths of linen bandaging. She set his foot on a folded blanket, positioned the wood pieces along the inner and outer sides of the ankle, and wrapped them with the bandaging in a pattern she was reasonably confident would hold. He watched her the whole time. She was aware of it. She kept her attention on her work. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd built. It would do. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold the joint stable and keep the bone from shifting until she could get him to the doctor in Sonora, which needed to happen tomorrow at the latest. The rain was still coming down outside. Through the window, she could see the barn, or what was left of it. The main structure was still standing, barely. The east end was open to the sky. The fire had lost its argument with the rain, eventually, which meant what remained was charred timber and wet ash and the smell of it coming in under the door. She sat on the floor beside his chair with her back against the wall, and her knees up and her hands loose in her lap. They were both wet, both smoke-streaked. The cabin was warm from the stove she'd built up earlier, and the fire there was doing its honest work, and the lamp on the table was burning steady, and the rain outside was heavy and present and rhythmic. He was looking at his hands. Then he looked at her. He said quietly, "Your body isn't a curse, Etta." His voice had something in it she'd never heard from him before. Rougher than usual, a different quality to it. Not performance. Something that had been pressed out of him by the night, rather than chosen. "It just saved my life." She looked at the fire in the stove. She sat with that for a moment. Really sat with it. She had been told her whole life what her body was. A burden, an inconvenience, an object of pity and commentary, an unsolicited opinion. She'd been told what it couldn't do, what it shouldn't attempt, what it disqualified her from. She'd absorbed so much of that, for so long, that she'd begun to maintain a running internal list of her body's failures, the way it marked her in every room she entered, the way it made simple things complicated, the way it had always, in her mind, been the primary argument against her. He hadn't said her body was beautiful. He hadn't said it in any of the forms people reached, for when they were trying to be encouraging about something they still fundamentally saw as a problem. He said it saved his life. Past tense, accomplished fact, as though the matter was settled, and now they could both know it. She pressed her lips together. She said, "It needed doing." He made a sound almost a laugh, short and exhaled, which was the closest she'd heard from him yet. "Etta, you would have gotten out," she said, eventually. "The roof would have been faster." She looked at him then. His face was serious. Not somber, he wasn't making a tragedy of it. Just stating a thing that was true, looking at her without flinching from what it meant. She looked back at the stove. "How bad is the ankle?" he said. "Fractured. You'll need the doctor in town tomorrow. Tonight you don't walk on it. The horses. I'll check on them in the morning. They'll have come down off the ridge by then. The cattle in the Southfield Gideon comes back tomorrow from Sonora. I'll send him down to the Southfield first thing." He was quiet. She could see him working through the list of things the ranch needed, and finding, one by one, that she'd already addressed them. He had that look, not surprised, not quite. More like a man finding additional confirmation of something. He'd been incrementally concluding. He said, "How did you learn the splinting?" "A book," she said. "Field Sanitation and Emergency Medicine. It was in the library's medical reference section. I read it because it interested me, and because I had the sense at some point in my life that knowing things had a better return than not knowing them." He nodded slowly. "My mother's idea originally," she said. "She believed that a woman who could only be ornamental had made herself deliberately helpless, and that helplessness was not, as some people seem to feel, an appealing quality. She read constantly. She taught me to do the same." She paused. "She died when I was 11. "I know," he said. "Your father told me." She looked at him. "His letter," Thatcher said. "He wrote about her. Some. Said she was the steadiest person he'd known, and that you got it from her." She didn't say anything for a moment. The rain outside changed pitch slightly. The storm was beginning to move past, the rain thinning from a downpour to a steady fall. "He would have said that," she said. He was not a man who exaggerated. No, he didn't read like one. She looked at the splinted ankle, the linen wrapping done in the cross pattern she'd read about. "He wrote to you about more than my mother." It wasn't a question. She wasn't ready to make it a question yet. She had the letter in the box, and she had the things the letter said, and she was not ready to open that conversation tonight. Not here, in the wet and smoke and relief of still being alive, not with him looking at her, with that expression she still couldn't fully read. "He did," Thatcher said. She nodded. "We'll talk about that." "When you're ready." "When I'm ready," she agreed. She got up from the floor. Her own arms were aching in a way that would be considerably worse tomorrow. She knew she'd used muscles tonight that she used regularly, but not like that. Not under that particular kind of load. She'd feel every inch of this for days. She went to the stove and put the kettle on again. She found the tin of dried chamomile she'd bought in Sonora and made 2 cups, and she brought his to him and set it on the table within his reach and sat down across from him with her own. She looked at the rain on the window. He looked at his cup. She said, "What was on the east wall, in the barn?" He knew what she was asking. The tools, the equipment, what was lost. He went through it methodically, without drama. 2 saddles, one beyond saving. The good harness set. 3 months of stored grain in the back corner. Probably a total loss from water and fire together. The hay. Most of the hand tools he kept on the wall pegs. The lumber stored for the roof repair, which was painfully ironic given the current state of the roof. She listened and made note in her head of what could be replaced affordably and what couldn't. The saddles were the worst of it. The grain was a significant loss, but could be sourced again. The tools could be rebuilt over time. The structure itself, she said. The bones of it. The left wall is gone. The east end is open. The rest of the frame is standing. I'll need to get up there and check the joints, but the main posts look solid. He drank his chamomile and set the cup down. 3 weeks of work, at least. Maybe 4. I can't do it on a fractured ankle. Gideon can, she said. Gideon can't do it alone. No, she agreed. He can't do it alone. She looked at him steadily. But I can lift a beam, apparently so. He looked at her. She looked back at him without any expression in particular. He said, "You're proposing to help rebuild a barn." "I'm proposing to do what needs doing," she said, which is how most things on this ranch seem to get decided. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your arms are going to be useless tomorrow." "Yes. And the day after that, I'll be functional again. Gideon will be back. We'll assess the damage in daylight and make a plan." He picked up his cup. She could see the shift in him, not surrender, not relief exactly. More like the particular adjustment of a man who has updated his understanding of a situation and is reorganizing around the new information. She'd seen it on him before, in smaller moments. He was good at it. Better than most people. He didn't resist the update. He just incorporated it and moved on. She respected that enormously. She got up after a while and heated water for washing and brought him a clean cloth and a bowl, and she went into the other room and changed out of her wet dress in the dark and hung it over the chair to dry and came back in her nightdress and her shawl and sat back down at the table. He'd washed his face. The soot was mostly gone. The burn on his forearm was dressed under the clean linen. He looked tired in the specific way of a person who has been through something physical, not beaten down, just emptied out all the day's resources spent. She said, "You should sleep. I'll sleep when you do." "That's not practical." "Probably not," he agreed. He didn't move. She looked at him. "Thatcher." He looked at her. "The barn can be rebuilt," she said. "You came out of it. That's the thing that matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you didn't have to come in after me." "Yes, I did. You could have waited outside. Called for help. Gone for Gideon." "Gideon was 4 miles away." She set her cup down. "And you were under a beam in a burning barn. What kind of person waits outside in that situation?" He didn't have an answer for that. She stood and took both cups to the basin and rinsed them and set them on the counter. She found the extra blanket in the cedar chest and brought it to him. He was looking at his hands again. She said, "Prop the ankle up on the second chair. Keep it elevated through the night." He shifted and did it. She put the blanket around his shoulders. She turned the lamp down low and stood in the dim room and looked at him sitting there, the burned arm, the splinted ankle, the wet hair drying in the heat of the stove, and something moved through her that she did not try to name, because naming it would require more composure than she currently had. She said, "Good night." He looked up at her. "Good night, Etta." She went into the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers, without undressing further, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. It was quieter now. The storm was moving northeast, carrying its bad temper off toward somewhere else. The steady tapping on the roof was falling into the rhythm that usually put her to sleep quickly. She lay awake for a long time. She thought about the beam. She thought about the smoke and the heat and the sound the hay made when it caught. She thought about his face when she came around the bale stack, and he saw her that sequence of things that moved through his expression so fast she'd almost missed it. She thought about what he'd said. Your body isn't a curse, Etta. It just saved my life. She looked at the dark ceiling. She had spent 26 years at war with herself. Not dramatically, not in any way that other people generally noticed, because she'd learned early to conduct that war quietly, to keep it contained below the surface where it didn't show. But it had been constant, and it had been exhausting, and she had never once, not until 5 weeks ago, not until a man dropped to one knee in the mud with his bare hand out, she had never once had occasion to seriously reconsider it. Now she'd had several. She thought about the chair he'd built, without saying a word about it. The steps that held, the plate he'd filled without asking. The way he'd stepped in front of Orson Finch in that dry goods store and said something true and undecorated and left no room for argument. She thought about her own hands under that beam, the weight of it, the fact that she had moved it. She pressed her palms flat against the bed on either side of her. These hands, this body, which had carried her across a continent and down from a stage in a rainstorm into a burning barn and back out again. She breathed. She was not ready to call it anything yet, to make any declaration to herself about what she believed, about what had changed. That was too large for tonight, and she was too tired. But she lay there, and she let the thought exist without fighting it. Maybe she had been wrong about this, about what she was. Maybe she had been wrong for a very long time. Outside, the rain settled into its quietest register, barely there, just a whisper on the roof. And somewhere up on the ridge, a horse made a sound and then went still. The stove in the main room ticked as the metal cooled. A log shifted. She slept. In the morning, the sky was scrubbed clean and the smell of smoke hung over the yard like a memory, and the barn stood missing its east end, like a man with his hat knocked sideways, still basically upright, still fundamentally itself. Gideon arrived before 7 and stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Etta, who was standing on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. He took it and looked at the barn again. Anyone hurt? Thatcher. Fractured ankle. Burn on the forearm. He needs the doctor today. I'll take him. He drank the coffee and looked at the barn a third time, this time with the professional eye of a man who was already doing measurements in his head. Beam come down? One of the cross beams from the loft. Left end of it. That's the rot section. I told him last fall, I know, she said. He knows. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at her arms, which were visibly sore. She was moving differently than usual. And he noticed it, because he noticed most things. He didn't say anything about it directly. He said, "You got him out." "We got out," she said. He drank his coffee and looked at the barn, and she could see him already planning it, where to start, what to pull down safely, what the frame needed, how long it would take. He was a man who met disasters practically. She appreciated that. It matched her own instinct. He said, 3 weeks if we push. That's what he said. He won't be able to work the first 2. No, but I will. Gideon looked at her then. A long, straight look, the kind he gave things he was assessing seriously. She held it. He said, "All right." That was all. He handed her his empty cup and walked across the yard toward the barn to begin. She stood on the porch and watched him go and drank her coffee and looked at the clear May sky above the ridge and thought about 3 weeks of barn work and a fractured ankle and a flower-streaked letter in a lockbox and a boy who needed to learn 4-syllable words and a land dispute that was not finished and a man in the chair inside who had looked at her last night like she was something he was still working out how to account for. She went inside and started breakfast. The letter had been in the lockbox for 3 weeks. Etta knew it was there. She'd put it there herself the evening they returned from Sonora, After she'd read it, standing at the cabin table with the afternoon light fading around her and her hands going very still, she'd folded it and locked it away and told herself she'd think about it when she was ready. She hadn't been ready. Not that day, not the days that followed. There had been too much else: the lessons with Toby, the barn rebuilding, Thatcher's ankle healing by slow degrees, the ordinary press of ranch work that didn't pause for a person's unresolved questions. But the letter waited. That was the thing about documents. They didn't tire of waiting. It was a Tuesday in the second week of June when she finally opened the lockbox again. Thatcher had gone to the south fence line with Gideon, his first full day of real physical work since the fire. His ankle declared functional enough by the doctor in Sonora 2 weeks prior. The morning had been clear and warm, and she'd watched them head out after breakfast with that particular feeling of a held breath releasing. He was all right. He was going to be all right. She'd cleaned the breakfast dishes. She'd put a pot of beans on the stove for the midday meal. She'd gone through her usual morning routine with the automatic ease of a habit fully formed. And then she'd stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the trunk at the foot of the bedroom bed, and she'd known it was time. She sat on the edge of the bed and worked the key from the cord around her neck and opened the lockbox. The letter from Boston was on top. She'd already read it. She set it aside. Below it was the secondary document, the one she'd registered on first reading and then deliberately not processed. The way you don't press on a bruise if you're not ready to know how bad it is. She lifted it out. It was not a simple letter. It was a legal document, several pages, close written in the formal language of banking contracts, with her father's handwriting on an accompanying explanatory note folded inside. The kind of document her father had spent 20 years producing and interpreting and filing carefully in the right drawer. She smoothed it on her knee and read it from the beginning. She was going to be thorough this time. She was not going to look at it sideways. It took her a while. The first page was the clearest a ledger record, dated December 1877, showing a banknote transfer. Her father's account, a sum she recognized as very nearly his entire savings. The note attached to that account, Vance, T.H., mortgage, Sonora, Texas. Paid in full. She sat very still. She read the explanatory note. Her father's handwriting was precise and small, the hand of a man who respected the economy of paper. He'd written without preamble, because he was not a man for preamble when the matter was serious. Etta, if you are reading this, then you have arrived safely, and the arrangement has been made. I am glad of it on both counts. What I am about to tell you, I did not put in the letter I sent Thatcher Vance, because I wanted him to take you in for the right reasons and not out of obligation to a man who had paid his way out of a bad situation. So I told him only that I was ill and that I hoped he would be willing to receive you. And he said yes, which is the kind of man he is. Here is what I did not tell him. 3 years ago, I was still working the loan desk at Bellamy and Sons, and I was tasked with reviewing a portfolio of delinquent notes that the bank was considering selling to outside buyers. One of those notes belonged to a Texas rancher named Thatcher Vance, whose mortgage had been purchased by a man named Orson Finch through a third-party arrangement. I was asked to process. What I found when I looked at the paperwork was irregular. The interest recalculations were wrong, not accidentally wrong. Wrong in the way that would produce a foreclosure inside of 4 years, regardless of what Vance paid, because the principal was being calculated against a fraudulent initial appraisal that inflated the property value by 60%. I documented what I found. My supervisor at Bellamy and Sons did not act on it. He had his own reasons for that, which I suspected and could not prove. I could not prove Finch's fraud, but I could remove the instrument he was using. So I used the money I had your mother's insurance settlement, most of my savings, what I'd put aside for your eventual marriage, and I bought the note myself through a legitimate channel and paid it off. Vance's ranch is now free of mortgage. The deed is clear. Finch has no legal instrument against the property anymore, though he will try other methods. I am telling you this now because you will need to know it, and because Thatcher Vance deserves to know what was done on his behalf. That is your decision to make how and when to tell him, because you are the one who will understand the situation better than I can from here. I want you to have a place to stand, Etta. That is all this was your father. She read it twice. Then she read the legal document again, more slowly, checking every figure. The sum, the date, the transfer of the note, her father's name on the payment record. She set both pages down on the bed beside her. She sat there looking at the window. Outside, the June morning was doing its ordinary work, cedars moving in a light wind, the recovered garden putting up green against the south wall of the cabin, a hawk describing patient circles above the ridge. All of it completely indifferent to what she had just understood. She thought about Thatcher in the rain that first night, one knee in the mud, his bare hand out. The lantern he'd trimmed and lit before he left the ranch. The clean sheets on the bed. She thought about the chair he'd built in the night without waking her. The steps he'd reinforced. The plate he'd filled without asking. The moment in Sonora when he'd moved in front of her without hesitation and said something that left no room for argument. She thought about the barn, his voice saying, "Your body isn't a curse, Etta. It just saved my life." She'd believed him. That was the thing. She'd believed every bit of it. She'd let herself believe it, carefully and by degrees, because it had seemed too large and too unlikely to take all at once, but she'd been letting it in, day by day, until she'd reached the point where she woke up in the morning and didn't perform the old inventory, didn't measure herself against the old ledger of what she cost versus what she offered. And now here was an actual ledger, with her father's money on it. Her hands were flat on the bed, on either side of the documents. She could feel the quilt under her palms, the texture of it, a physical thing to hold on to while her mind did what it was doing. Her father had paid Thatcher's mortgage. Her father had arranged this, not as a favor between friends exactly, but as a transaction her safety purchased with a man's debt forgiven, even if the debt wasn't described in those terms and the forgiveness wasn't mentioned at all. She thought, Thatcher knows his mortgage was paid. He has to know. You don't not notice when a banknote disappears, she thought. Did he know who paid it? She thought about his face across the table the night she'd mentioned her father. His letter, Thatcher had said. He wrote about her sum. Careful, contained. The specific economy of a man choosing what to say. She thought about, he wrote to you about more than my mother. And Thatcher's answer, he did. Just those two words. Then, we'll talk about that. When you're ready. He'd known she wasn't ready. He'd known there was something she'd need to come to in her own time, because he'd known what there was to come to. Her throat closed. She sat with it for a while, the particular quality of a thing that is true, and that you cannot unhear. Her father had paid for her place here. Whatever Thatcher had felt or shown or built in the quiet hours of the night, it had begun as a transaction between a dying man and a man with a debt, and whatever came after that was colored by the fact of it, would always be colored by the fact of it, because she could not now unknow it, and she could not pretend she didn't see it. She thought about walking into that barn. She thought about choosing to walk. She had walked in because she loved him. That was the simple, true fact of it, that she had been circling for weeks, without permitting herself to land on it directly. She had walked into a burning barn, with the smoke already thick because the alternative was unacceptable. You didn't love a person like that because of what they owed your father. You didn't love them like that out of obligation. But did he? She pressed her palms harder against the quilt. She could feel the question arranging itself into something cold and settled, the way a thing goes from fluid to fixed when the temperature drops far enough. A question she couldn't answer by herself because the answer lived in him, and she did not know, she genuinely did not know, Whether what he'd given her these past 6 weeks was a man's honest feeling or a man's conscientious debt repayment, whether he saw her at all, the actual her, or whether he saw a weight on the scale that had been partially balanced by her father's bank draft. She had been wrong about herself for so long. She'd thought she was a burden, and he'd said she wasn't. She'd thought she didn't deserve to eat, and he'd filled her plate. She'd thought her body was the argument against her, and it had lifted a beam off his legs in a burning barn. She'd been wrong about all of that, and she'd let herself be persuaded because he was persuasive in the particular way of people who simply tell the truth without decoration. But what if the truth he'd been telling was more complicated than she'd understood? What if the man who'd been kind to her had been kind because her father paid him to be? Not in those words, not consciously, maybe not even in a way he'd admit to himself, but underneath it all, a debt acknowledged and honored, the way a good man honors a debt. She looked at the documents on the bed. She thought, I don't know, and I cannot sit here. She got up, she moved to the table, and she found a sheet of paper, one of Toby's spare sheets from the lesson box, and she found a pencil. She sat down and she wrote, not a long note. She was not her father. She was not a woman who could write clearly when she was this far from clear. She wrote what she could. I found the papers. I need to think. Please don't come after me tonight. She folded it. She set it on the table where he would see it. She looked around the cabin, the wide chair he'd built for her. The windowsill where her mother's manuscripts had dried that first night, still slightly warped along the edges. The lesson box on the shelf, the gray twill dress hanging on the peg, the one she'd sewn herself from the fabric they'd bought together in Sonora, the day he'd stepped in front of Orson Finch. She put on her shawl. She picked up nothing else. She went out. The afternoon had shifted while she'd been inside. The sky to the southwest was doing something, not a full storm, not the violence of the spring squalls, but a heavy overcast rolling in from the Gulf, the kind that brought low, persistent rain rather than lightning. The air had that particular weight to it. She knew the feeling of it now. She'd learned the sky here. She walked. She didn't have a direction. She walked the way she'd always walked when she needed to, back in Boston fast, purposeful, the movement itself doing something that sitting still couldn't do. Through the ranch gate and down the track toward the south field, then off the track and into the cedar breaks, where the ground was uneven, and she had to pay attention to where she was putting her feet, which was useful. Attention on her feet meant less attention on the cold thing lodged in her chest. The rain started quietly. Not heavy yet, just present, the soft, persistent kind that she'd learned meant hours rather than minutes. She walked further than she meant to. She was thinking about her father. He had spent 20 years at a bank desk. He had been careful and methodical and precise, and he had loved her with the restrained, consistent love of a man who was not demonstrative, but was absolutely reliable. He had never missed a birthday. He had never, in her memory, spoken unkindly about her body not once, not even in the coded language people used when they were trying to be honest. He had simply proceeded on the assumption that she was a person worthy of full regard, and he had built his life around that assumption quietly. He had also made an arrangement without telling her about it. She understood why. She did. He'd written it plainly. I wanted him to take you in for the right reasons. He'd wanted the thing to be real and not to be complicated by obligation on either side. He'd wanted her to arrive and be received on her own terms, not as a debt being honored. But the debt existed. It had existed from the first moment. Thatcher had stood in the rain, holding a lantern for a woman whose father had cleared his mortgage, and whatever he'd felt when he dropped to one knee in the mud, whatever had moved through him in that moment, it existed inside the frame of that debt, whether he liked it or not. She stopped. She was at the edge of the south field, where the cedar thins and the land drops away slightly toward the creek. The rain was coming down more steadily now. She could see the line of cottonwoods along the creek bottom, pale green and silver in the rain light. She sat down on a flat rock at the edge of the drop and pulled her shawl tighter and looked at the creek. Her father had wanted her to have a place to stand. She thought about that sentence. She'd thought about it before the first time she'd seen it. In the letter he'd sent Thatcher, a version of the same thought. At minimum, a place to stand upright. Her father writing the same idea, two different ways, to two different people, which meant it was the idea he actually held about her situation. The center of it, the thing he believed, was the essential problem. She had not had a place to stand. Not in Boston, where the boarding house and the library and the streets had all been places she moved through but did not occupy. Not in any room she'd ever entered where her body preceded her and defined what people saw before she had a chance to be anything else. She'd been surviving, not standing, moving through without landing. And then she'd come here, and she'd landed, carefully and by degrees, and it had felt like the first actual solid ground she'd stood on in her life. She pressed her hands against the wet rock on either side of her. What if the ground was only solid because her father had paid for it? She was crying. She hadn't noticed when it started, but her face was wet, and not just from the rain. And she didn't try to stop it because there was no one here to see, and she was very tired of being composed about the things that cost her the most. She thought about 6 weeks. 6 weeks of mornings where she woke up without the inventory. 6 weeks of eating breakfast without calculating whether she was worth it. 6 weeks of a boy learning to write his own name and a chair built in the night and a man standing in front of her in a dry goods store and saying something clean and true. She thought, I don't want it to be obligation. I don't want to be his debt. The rain came down on her, and she sat on the rock and let it. She had crossed a continent. She had gotten up off the ground in the mud and gotten in the wagon and arrived at this ranch and learned the sound of its mornings and the rhythm of its days. And she had walked into a burning barn and lifted a beam off a man's legs. And she had let herself believe, slowly and carefully, and at enormous emotional cost, that she was worth the believing. She was not going to give that back. Not quietly. Not without making sure she understood exactly what was true. But she needed to know. She needed to hear it from him directly without his consideration for her feelings shaping what he said. She needed to know whether the man who'd knelt in the mud and built the chair and filled her plate had done those things because of who she was or because of what her father had arranged. She needed to ask him. Not tonight. Not like this, in the rain, with her face wet and her chest tight and her thinking still this tangled. She'd said in the note not to come after her, and she'd meant it. She needed the time and the air and the rain to work through enough of this that she could ask the question properly, the way a question that mattered deserved to be asked. She looked at the creek. The water was up slightly from the recent rains, moving with a low, steady voice over the rocks. She'd sat here once before, in her 3rd week, watching a heron work the shallows. The heron was not here today. She breathed. She thought about what her father had actually done. He'd found fraud. He'd documented it and been ignored and been unable to prove it, and so he'd done the one thing he could do. He'd removed the instrument. He'd used his savings to clear a note he'd had no personal obligation to clear for a man he barely knew, because the alternative was leaving a good man exposed to a system working against him. He'd also gotten his daughter out of Boston in the process. She was clear-eyed enough to see that part. He'd arranged 2 things at once, the way a careful man does when resources are limited. He'd been dying. He'd had 1 act left in him, and he'd made it do as much as it could. She could not be angry at him for it. She wanted to be, slightly. The anger was easier, but she couldn't sustain it. He'd been trying to give her what she needed. He'd also been trying to do right by Thatcher, in his way. He'd just done it without telling either of them the full picture. And now she was sitting in the rain on a rock figuring out what the full picture meant. The rain got heavier. She didn't move for a while. She let herself be cold and wet and unhappy and uncertain because those were the things she was. and pretending otherwise had never actually helped anything. She thought about, we'll talk about that, the careful patience of it. A man who knew something was coming and was willing to wait for her to arrive at it without pushing. She thought about when you're ready. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked at the gray sky above the ridge. She didn't know if he loved her. She thought he might. She thought the things he'd done and said couldn't all be accounted for by obligation, that there was too much specificity in them, too much quiet care that went beyond what a debt required. But she didn't know. And she understood now, sitting here in the rain at the edge of the Southfield. That, not knowing, was the thing she couldn't live with. She had come to Texas to reclaim her right to exist without shame. That was what she'd told herself on the long train ride west. She'd said it in different words, a place to stand, a life that fit, something different from Boston. But that was the root of it. She'd come to stop being a footnote in other people's lives and be the main fact of her own. She was not going to trade one kind of invisibility for another. She was not going to be the woman a man kept because his conscience required it. She was going to ask him, tomorrow, clearly and directly, the way hard questions deserve to be asked. She stood up from the rock. Her legs were stiff from sitting still in the cold, and her dress was thoroughly soaked, and her face was a mess. She didn't particularly care about any of that. She turned back toward the ranch. She walked back through the cedar breaks in the rain, picking her way carefully in the low light, and she was about halfway to the fence line when she heard it, her name. Not shouted. The rain would have covered shouting. It was the specific carrying quality of a voice that knew the land it was traveling across, that knew where to aim and how. It came from somewhere ahead of her and to the left, and she stopped. Etta. She stood still in the rain. She heard it again, closer this time. And then, through the cedar, she saw the lantern. It was the same lantern he'd carried that first night at Willow Creek Crossing. The same one. He'd trimmed the wick before he left then, too. She'd noticed the steadiness of it in the rain, and he'd trimmed it again tonight, and he was coming through the cedar break on a crutch she'd seen him refuse to use for 2 weeks because he didn't need it anymore. He was using it now, in the dark and the wet, moving through uneven terrain on a recently fractured ankle because he had read her note and he had come anyway. She said, I told you not to come. He came through the last of the cedars and stopped when he saw her. He was soaked through. The lantern was doing what lanterns do, holding against the rain, steady against the weather, illuminating the circle of ground between them. He looked at her. He said, I know what you found. She stood very still. Your father told me about the note, he said. Not in his first letter. After I'd written back and said yes, he wrote again and told me what he'd done and why. He shifted his weight on the crutch. His face was wet and completely serious, and she could see him choosing his words the same way he always did, not performing it, just doing it, because he was a man who meant what he said and took the time to make sure what he said was what he meant. He told me not to tell you right away. He said you'd need time to settle into the place before you'd be able to hear it without it meaning the wrong thing. She said, did he tell you what the wrong thing was? He said you'd think I was keeping you out of obligation. A pause. He was right that you'd think it. He was wrong that it was true. The rain came down between them, she said. How am I supposed to know? That, he said. You walked into a burning barn. She waited. I've thought about that every day since it happened, he said. You walked in. I hadn't asked you to. There was no arrangement that required it. You came in because you... He stopped, started again. A person doesn't do that for obligation, Etta. A person does that because they can't do otherwise. She pressed her lips together. I know what I felt that first night, he said. Standing in that rain, holding a lantern for a woman I'd never met. Knowing only what her father had written about her, I was not standing there thinking about a banknote. I was standing there because Walter Higgins had written please 4 times on one page, and because that meant something, and because when I said yes to that letter, I was saying yes to a person, not a debt. He paused, And then you came out of that coach and went down in the mud, and you looked up at me, and you said 3 words that had nothing small in them. And I... He stopped. She was crying again. She could feel it. She didn't try to stop it. He said, I don't know how to say it the way it deserves to be said. I'm not built for saying things that size. But I know what's true. Your father cleared my mortgage because he was a good man trying to protect 2 people at once. And I am grateful for it. And it has nothing to do with why I built that chair, or why I went into Sonora with you, or why I'm standing in this cedar break in the rain on a busted ankle, because I read your note and couldn't stay in that cabin. She looked at the lantern between them, the flame inside it, steady against the weather. I'm not a debt you pay off, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. No, he said, you're not. I refuse to be, I know. She looked at his face. Wet and serious and completely steady, the same face that had looked at her in the mud without flinching, that had looked at her across a table in a dry goods store, right before he stepped in front of something ugly, that had looked at her in a barn with soot on it and said something she was still carrying. She said, I need you to understand that I came here for myself. Not just for my father's arrangement. Not just for somewhere safe. For myself because I chose to. I know that, he said. I knew it that first night, she breathed. The rain fell between them, and the lantern held, and the cedar was dark around them, and her dress was soaked through, and her face was wet, and she was standing in a Texas beater break in the middle of the night, and none of that felt like the wrong place to be. She said, we're going to talk about the rest of this. Yes, he said, we are. Not tonight. No, not tonight. She walked toward him through the rain until she was close enough that the lantern light reached her face. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with that expression she'd been slowly learning to read, the one that was too many things at once, that she'd thought she couldn't interpret, but was beginning to understand, was simply a face that told the truth about what it held. She took the lantern from him, so he had both hands for the crutch. She said, come on, your ankle? He said nothing. He adjusted his grip on the crutch and started back through the cedar, and she walked beside him, carrying the lantern, and the rain came down steadily around them, and the light between them held the way it had always held, trimmed right, steady against the weather, illuminating the ground ahead, one careful step at a time. They walked back to the cabin without speaking much. That was all right. Etta had learned, over 6 weeks of living alongside Thatcher Vance, that silence between 2 people could be either empty or full, and this one was full. Too much had been said in the cedar break for anything more to be necessary yet. The lantern swung in her hand. His crutch found the ground carefully in the dark. The rain came down steady and cold around them. She held the gate for him, and he went through, and she followed, and they crossed the yard and went up the porch, steps he'd built to hold and into the cabin. She hung the lantern and got the fire going higher without being asked. He got himself settled in the straight-backed chair, the crutch leaning against the wall beside him, and she brought warm water and unwrapped the ankle and checked it the same way the doctor had shown her, looking for swelling, for any sign that tonight's walk had cost more than it should have. It had cost something. She could see that, but not more than it could manage. She rewrapped it without comment and stood up. He said, Etta. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said, for not telling you sooner. She thought about that for a moment. She turned it over the way she turned most things over, not rushing to a response, but actually considering it. You were waiting for me to be ready, she said. That's what you said. Your father thought you should know on your own terms. I thought he understood you better than I did at the time. A pause. I'm not sure I was right to defer to it, as long as I did, she said. You couldn't have told me that first night. No. Or the first week. No. So when? She sat down across from him. When was the right time in your judgment? He looked at his hands. I kept waiting for a moment that felt like solid ground, like something had been established between us that could hold the weight of it. He looked up at her. The barn happened before I'd decided. She thought about that. She thought about what he'd said out in the cedar break. The part she was still working through a person doesn't do that for obligation. She thought about her own feet walking through that barn-burn door, the smoke already thick, not a single moment of deliberation, just going because she could not do otherwise. She understood what he meant. She just wasn't completely finished being unsettled by it. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it the same way you answer everything, without adjusting for how I might feel. He met her eyes. All right. Did you ever at any point think of me as the debt? Not consciously, maybe. But did any part of how you treated me come from the fact of what my father did? Thatcher was quiet, for long enough that she knew he was actually examining the question rather than just dismissing it to reassure her. That steadied her more than a fast answer would have. No, he said, not the way you mean. I knew about the note from your father's second letter, and I'll tell you what I thought when I read it. He shifted slightly in the chair, finding a more comfortable angle for the ankle. I thought, this man spent his last years trying to fix something that wasn't his fault and protect two people at the same time, and he did it quietly and without asking for acknowledgement. And I thought that said something about the daughter he raised. He paused. What your father did was a generous act toward a stranger. I was grateful. But it didn't change what I was doing when I stood at Willow Creek Crossing with that lantern. I'd already decided what I was going to be for whoever came off that stage, she said. What had you decided? That I was going to be decent, he said simply. Whatever else happened, whether she stayed or left or found the whole thing impossible, I was going to be a decent man. That much I could control. She looked at the fire. And then you came out of that coach, he said. And it stopped being about what I'd decided. She pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at them. Her hands, the ones she'd had under that beam, the ones she'd used to splint his ankle and set his pages in the valise the first night and turn cornbread out of the cast iron and write lesson plans for a boy who was learning to put himself on a page, she said. I believe you. He waited. I'm still working through the rest of it, she said. But that part I believe you. He nodded once. Not relieved exactly. More like a man who'd been carrying a weight at a certain angle and had finally been allowed to set it down properly. She made chamomile. She brought it to the table and they sat with it. And the fire worked, and outside the rain continued its steady, impersonal work against the roof. After a while, she said, my father was not a man who made grand gestures. I got that from his letters. He made small, very precise ones. He decided what was right, and then he did it. And he didn't talk about it afterward, because talking about it seemed to him like asking for credit. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He would have hated knowing I was upset about this. He would have understood it, though, Thatcher said. Yes, she paused. He always understood things he would have hated. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. The morning came in gray and clearing. The storm fully passed, the sky doing that pastrained scrubbing that left everything looking slightly too clean and bright. She lay in bed for a while before getting up, not thinking exactly, just letting the night settle into proportion. Things looked different in the morning, not easier always, but more accurately sized. She got up and built the fire and started breakfast. And when Thatcher came through from the lean-to, he'd insisted on it despite the ankle, which she'd objected to and lost. He sat down at the table, and she put food in front of him and sat down herself, and they ate. He said, I want to talk about what comes next. With Finch. She looked up. Not today, he said. But soon. There are things you know about your father's documentation, about the banking law that matter to what I'm going to have to do. I know, she said. I've been thinking about it. I figured, she almost smiled. Was it obvious? You get a particular expression, he said, when you're organizing a problem. Your eyes go very still. She hadn't known that about herself. She filed it away. My father's documentation is in the lockbox. The ledger pages, the original note, the letter explaining what he found. It's not a full case, he said as much. He couldn't prove the fraud directly, but it's a record. She paused. A record in a bank clerk's handwriting, in a legal format, dated and filed correctly. That's not nothing. No, Thatcher said. That's not nothing. And there are other instruments. Finch can't use against you now that the mortgage is clear. The foreclosure path is closed. What he has left is the creek boundary dispute and whatever pressure he can bring through the county system. She drank her coffee, which is considerable, but it's not unlimited. Thatcher looked at her across the table. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said slowly, that a man who has been operating fraudulently for this long has done it in more than one place. My father found it in the Bellamy and Sons portfolio. But Finch has operated in this county for years. He has the land office. He has the bank. She set her cup down. He will have left traces, because men who believe they're untouchable are rarely as careful as they think they are. Thatcher said nothing for a moment. Then, you're talking about looking. I'm talking about being prepared, she said. When the circuit judge comes through next. Being prepared with more than a boundary dispute and a good argument. He nodded, slow and considering. Gideon's been watching Finch's operations longer than I have. He's seen things. Then we should talk to Gideon. Yes, Thatcher said. We should. That was where the planning began, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just two people at a breakfast table, deciding to address a problem with the tools they actually had, which was how most necessary things got started. Gideon came up from the south field that morning and found them both on the porch, with the account books open between them. He looked at the scene and looked at both their faces and took in whatever information was available in the set of Etta's shoulders and the particular quality of Thatcher's stillness. And he said, "The papers. You knew about them?" Etta said. "I knew something was coming," Gideon said. He sat on the porch rail. "Thatcher told me there was a thing he was waiting on. I didn't ask the details." She looked at Thatcher. He said, "I told him the situation might get complicated around the time you arrived." "I didn't tell him what or why," Gideon said. "To the middle distance rather than to either of them. I've been watching Finch's operation for 2 years. If you're looking for irregularities, I can tell you where to start looking." This was how it went. Not a speech, not a declaration, just a man who had been paying attention for a long time, quietly, and was now offering what he'd collected. They sat on the porch for an hour, and Gideon talked, and Etta wrote in her notebook, and Thatcher listened. Gideon described 3 specific instances he'd witnessed or heard reliably, secondhand. A boundary marker moved the previous fall that 2 of Finch's own men had been ordered to relocate. A loan transaction that a freedman named Amos Carter had described to Gideon in detail. A water rights document that had been filed in the county office listing measurements that didn't match the actual creek geography by a considerable margin. Etta wrote all of it down. She organized it as she wrote, not just recording, but structuring, building the shape of what they had versus what they needed. When Gideon finished, she looked at her notes. "Amos Carter," she said. "Is he still in the county?" "He's on the Whitmore place, 3 miles east. He left Finch's operation 8 months ago." "Would he talk to someone?" Gideon considered. "He'd talk to me," he said. "And if I introduced you, he'd probably talk to you." She looked at Thatcher. Thatcher said, "We'd need the judge to actually read what we bring, which is the part I don't know how to solve." "I know a little about that," Etta said. "My father taught me some of it. There are forms a document has to take to be received as evidence in a judicial proceeding. A sworn statement is different from a conversation. A filed record is different from a description of one." She closed the notebook. "We'd need to do this correctly." "Precisely. In the legal language, the judge is required to respond to." Thatcher looked at her. "Can you write it that way?" "I can write it correctly," she said. "I've read enough of my father's work to know the form, and I know what we need: the sworn statements, the documentation, the records your father's papers started." She paused. "It will take time. The judge comes in August," Thatcher said. "We have 2 months. Then we have 2 months, she said. Gideon got up from the rail and picked up his toolkit and looked at both of them with the professional assessment he gave everything he was about to build. I'll go see Amos this week, he said. Then he went around the side of the cabin and got on with his day. The weeks that followed were full. The barn rebuilding was the loudest of it, literally loud. The sound of hammering starting at first light and running through to the early afternoon when the heat made it impractical. Etta had meant what she'd said about helping, and she did. Her arms had recovered by the fourth day after the fire, and she was strong in the ways that barn work required, and she learned quickly which tasks she could take on and which needed a different skill set. She hauled timber and held boards and passed tools and climbed the frame further than Gideon initially thought she would, and she did all of it without announcement, the same way Thatcher did things because it needed doing. Thatcher worked from the ground for the first week, directing and doing what he could manage on the ankle, and by the second week, he was back on the frame with careful placements. And by the end of the third, the barn was more solid than it had been before the fire. Gideon had replaced the rot sections he'd been arguing about for a year and added ventilation he'd wanted to add and used better timber throughout. And the result was a structure that would last considerably longer than the original. The schoolhouse planning continued alongside all of it. Etta's porch lessons with Toby had expanded. 2 more children had appeared quietly, without any organized effort on her part, just word spreading the way it spreads in small places. A girl named Luisa, 8 years old, the daughter of a Mexican-American ranching family to the east, who had heard about the mute boy learning to read and brought her daughter, with a formal and very courteous note, asking if there was room. A boy named Samuel, 10, whose family were freedmen farming, a small plot north of the Vance property, who arrived one afternoon with his mother and stood quietly on the porch step until Etta invited him in. She made room. She adjusted the lesson plan. She found that teaching 3 children simultaneously was different. From teaching one, the pace was harder to manage, the range of needs was wider, and she figured it out the same way she figured most things out, by paying attention and adjusting. Gideon watched Louisa reading aloud one afternoon with an expression she couldn't fully see from where she was sitting, but Thatcher could from where he was standing by the fence. He didn't say anything about it at supper, but that night, after she'd gone to bed, she heard the 2 of them talking on the porch in low voices for a long time. In the evenings, when the light was still good, she worked on the documents. It was the most demanding writing she'd ever done. Not emotionally, it was precise, technical, formal work, the language her father had used and taught her in pieces over the years, the language of legal record and sworn testimony. She wrote carefully, checking each sentence against her memory of the forms, revising when something wasn't exact enough. She worked from her father's documents as the foundation and built out from them, Gideon's accounts organized into a coherent timeline, Amos Carter's sworn statement written out from the interview Gideon had conducted and reviewed with her, twice for accuracy. The water rights discrepancy laid out in plain numerical comparison against the county survey. Thatcher read everything she wrote. He asked questions. He corrected things he knew factually, and she corrected things he had wrong about the legal framing. And between them, the document became something she was willing to stand behind. She was working on the final summary one evening when Thatcher came in from the barn and stood at the end of the table and looked at the pages spread across it. He said, "How much longer?" "A week," she said. "Maybe less. The Amos Carter statement is the last piece I need to formalize." He looked at the pages, at her handwriting covering them, systematic and clear. "Your father taught you well. He believed in the usefulness of things," she said. "He thought the best thing a person could give a child was a tool that worked. He gave me books and banking law, and the belief that precision mattered." She looked at the pages. "I think he knew somewhere that I'd need something more than domestic skills to make my way." He was right. He usually was. She set her pen down. I miss him. Thatcher didn't say anything to that immediately. He pulled out the other chair and sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "He wrote about you with a lot of care." She looked at him. The first letter was practical. The arrangement, the reason for it, what he was asking. He folded his hands on the table. The second letter, after I'd written back that one was different. He wrote about you the way a man writes when he doesn't have much time left and he wants to make sure the important things are said. He wrote about watching you work at the library, the way you'd memorize the location of every volume so you could help people without moving through the stacks in front of them. He paused. He said that was the thing that broke his heart about it. Not that you were in pain. That you had arranged your whole life to make your pain invisible, because you'd learned that was the only way to be permitted to exist. She was very still. He said he hoped wherever you landed, someone would be worth the unlearning. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the documents on the table, her father's handwriting at the bottom of the original note, precise and small. She knew that handwriting so well she could have reproduced it. She'd copied it 10,000 times as a child, practicing her letters against his. "He should have told me about the mortgage," she said. "I understand why he didn't, but he should have." "Yes," Thatcher said. "He should have. It was his one blind spot," she said. "He believed in arranging things correctly more than he believed in telling people the arrangements. He thought if the structure was right, the rest would follow." She picked up her pen and set it down again. He wasn't wrong exactly. The structure was right. He just forgot that people need to understand the structure they're standing in. Thatcher said, quietly. "Is the structure right, now that you understand it?" She looked at him across the table. She thought about the question, the whole weight of it. The 6 weeks before she found the papers, the cedar break in the rain, the morning after, the conversations since. The work they'd been doing together on the documents, which was something neither of them could have done alone. His steadiness against her precision. Her legal knowledge against his ground-level knowledge of the land and the county and the people. She thought about Toby. Writing. Toby is here on a piece of paper and handing it to her like a gift. She thought about the chair he'd built in the night. She said, "Yes, it's right." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way he nodded, when something was settled and didn't need more words, and she picked up her pen and went back to the document. He stayed at the table. He got out the account book and worked on his own figures, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, while the Texas evening settled in around the cabin, and neither of them said much more, and it was enough. 3 days before the circuit judge was due in Sonora, something happened that changed the calculation. Etta was coming back from the south field with Gideon, where they'd gone to check on the lower fence that Finch's cattle had been pushing against when she saw the smoke. It was in the wrong place for the cabin or the barn. East, further east, and then she understood. She ran. By the time they reached the site of the would-be schoolhouse, the cleared ground, the poured foundation corners, Gideon had said last week, the stack of lumber delivered. 2 days ago, the lumber was burning. Someone had arranged it to burn. There was nothing accidental in the pattern of it. She stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at the fire and felt something move through her that was not grief and not fear. It was closer to resolution, the kind that comes when something you expected finally arrives, and you find you were more prepared for it than you thought. Gideon said very low, "Finch." "Yes," she said. Thatcher had seen the smoke from the barn and was coming across the yard at a pace that told her his ankle was not fully happy about it. He reached them and looked at the burning lumber and at Etta's face, and then back at the lumber. He said, "We're not going to be able to prove he did this." "No," she said, "not directly." She looked at the fire. At the foundation corners Gideon had set, still solid in the ground, untouched. The lumber could be replaced. The foundation was still there. But we don't have to prove this specifically. We have to prove the pattern. And this is part of the pattern. She turned and looked at both of them. We add it to the document. with a date and a description. Sworn by all three of us, Gideon said. That's 3 witnesses, yes, she said. It is. She looked at the burning lumber for another moment. She was angry. She was going to let herself be angry about this, because the anger was correct and it had somewhere to go. She was also not going to let the anger be louder than the plan, because the plan was what would actually accomplish something. She turned away from the fire. I need to finish the summary document tonight, she said, and we need to add this. Then it's done. She walked back to the cabin and sat down at the table and wrote for 3 hours straight until the lamp was burning low and her hand was tired and every page was exactly as precise as she could make it. Then she set the pen down and stacked the pages carefully and looked at what she'd built. Her father's handwriting at the foundation, her own throughout, Gideon's careful signed statement on the 3rd page, Amos Carter's sworn account on the 6th, the water rights discrepancy laid out in plain numbers on the 8th, the burned lumber dated and described and witnessed on the last. She thought, this is what you do with the truth. You write it down, precisely, in the language the system is required to respond to, and you put it in front of the people who have to act on it. That was what her father had tried to do. He hadn't had enough. She had more. She folded the document and put it in the lockbox beside his letter. She turned the key. She sat for a moment in the quiet cabin. Outside, the Texas night was large and clear, the post-rain sky fully open, stars doing their patient work above the ridge. Somewhere up there, the horses were probably asleep. Toby was in town, in the boarding house room, and maybe he was reading something she'd sent home with him, or maybe he was just sleeping. Gideon was in his house a mile down the property line, and Thatcher was in the lean-to because he was stubborn about that particular thing and she'd stopped arguing. She pressed her hand flat on the lockbox lid. Her father had wanted her to have a place to stand. She had one. It wasn't because he'd bought it for her. It wasn't because Thatcher had decided to be decent. It wasn't because the chair fit or the steps held. It was because she had stood in it day after day and done the work and made the decisions and built the things that needed building, and now she had a document in a lockbox that told the truth in the language that mattered. She was here. She had made herself here. She stood up and turned the lamp down and went to bed, and she slept well, and in the morning she would begin the last part of it. The morning Etta walked into the county courthouse. She wore the gray twill dress she'd sewn herself and carried her father's papers in a leather satchel she'd borrowed from Thatcher. She'd spent the previous 3 evenings reading and rereading every page, making sure she could speak to each one without looking down. The document had to do its own work when it got in front of the judge. She had to do hers. Thatcher walked beside her. His ankle was mostly healed, not perfect, probably never going to be perfect, but functional enough that he'd put the crutch away a week ago, without ceremony. Gideon came on her other side, moving with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had decided exactly where he stood on a matter and wasn't reconsidering it. The 3 of them walked down Sonora's main street together in the morning light. People noticed. She'd known they would. She'd made her peace with being noticed, had been working on that piece for weeks, adding to it daily, the way you add mortar to a wall, patient and unglamorous. She kept her eyes on the courthouse at the end of the street, and her pace steady and her chin level, and she did not make herself smaller than she was. The circuit judge's name was Aldous Prentice. She'd learned what she could about him. In advance, he'd served in 3 counties for 11 years, had a reputation for reading paperwork carefully before court, kept a neat docket. Thatcher had met him once and said he was a man who asked direct questions. That was useful information. She was good with direct questions. Orson Finch was already there when they arrived. He was standing in the anteroom with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from San Antonio she didn't recognize, and 2 of the men from his operation. He looked at Etta, when she came through the door, with the same measuring contempt he'd used in the dry goods store. She looked back at him without any expression in particular, and walked past him to the clerk's desk. She filed the document herself, set it on the counter in front of the clerk, and said, "Clearly, I'd like this entered into the record for today's proceeding. It pertains to the water rights dispute and to a pattern of fraudulent land practices in this county. There are 6 sworn statements attached, including testimony from 2 witnesses currently in Finch County and a banking record originating from Bellamy and Sons in Boston." The clerk looked at the document, looked at her, looked at the document again. "This is substantial," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He stamped it and assigned it a case number and said the judge would receive it before the session opened. She turned around. Finch was still watching her from across the room. She met his gaze for a moment, not aggressively, not with any performance of defiance, just steadily. Then she went and sat down next to Thatcher on the bench along the wall. He was looking at the window. After a moment, he said quietly, "How do you feel?" "Prepared," she said. He nodded. He knew better by now than to offer comfort she didn't need. The session opened at 10 o'clock. Judge Prentice was a compact, precise man in his 60s, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and he opened the document she'd submitted before he opened anything else. She watched him read it. He read the way her father had read important things carefully, with complete attention, going back to recheck figures. He didn't look up until he'd finished all 12 pages. Then he looked at her over his glasses. "You authored this?" "With assistance," she said. "The banking records are my father's original documentation. Walter Higgins, formerly of Bellamy and Sons, Boston. He passed in March. The sworn statements were gathered and reviewed by myself and by Gideon Sterling, who is present." Prentice looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him. "The water rights figures on page 8, Prentice said. "These are your measurements?" "We used the county survey as baseline," Etta said. "The discrepancy between the county's recorded measurements and those filed by Finch Land Services is documented on that page. The figures are not complicated. They don't add up." She said it plainly, not accusingly, just as a matter of arithmetic. Finch's lawyer rose to object. Prentice waved him down without looking at him and kept reading. What followed was 3 hours of careful, methodical legal work, the kind that isn't dramatic, isn't passionate, doesn't make anyone's blood run hot. It was numbers and dates and recorded testimony, and the specific grinding work of demonstrating that a pattern existed. Etta testified for 40 minutes. She answered every question directly. When Finch's lawyer tried to rattle her with rapid-fire objections, she waited for each one to finish and then continued exactly where she'd left off. She didn't get flustered. She'd been managing rooms that wanted her to fail for her entire life. This was just a room with better furniture. Amos Carter testified through Gideon's introduction, and he was credible in the way that genuine first-hand experience is always credible, specific, and undecorated. The account of a man who remembered exactly what he'd seen because it had directly affected him. Finch's lawyer made his case. It was a confident case, built on social weight rather than documentation, the kind of argument that relies on the room already being inclined toward you. Etta had anticipated it. The document she'd built was specifically designed to be less interesting to argue against and more interesting to read, because paper didn't care what county you owned. Prentice recessed for an hour. When he came back, his face was the same precise, unrevealing face it had been all morning. He removed his glasses and addressed the room. He said the water rights filing was materially inaccurate and would be voided pending resurvey. He said the loan transaction involving Amos Carter's property presented sufficient irregularity to warrant referral to the State Banking Commission. He said the boundary marker evidence required further investigation by county law. He did not take Finch into custody. That had never been a likely outcome on the first pass of something like this, and she'd known it. What he did was close every legal avenue Finch had been using against the Vance Ranch and open an inquiry into 3 others. Finch left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Etta stood outside in the midday sun and felt the air on her face and breathed. Thatcher stood beside her. After a moment, he said, "It's not finished." "No," she agreed, "but it started properly." Gideon came out and stood on her other side. He looked down the street in the direction Finch had gone. Then he looked at the courthouse. Then he looked at nothing in particular for a while. He said, "Your father would have appreciated the methodology," she said. "He would have found two things I could have cited better." "Probably," Gideon said. "And he would have been right." She almost laughed. It came out as a breath, but it was close. Thatcher put his hand on her back, brief, unremarkable, just there for a moment. She leaned into it slightly before they both straightened and started back down the street. Behind them, through the courthouse window, the clerk was stamping the record. That evening, Toby arrived at the ranch at his usual time. He came around to the porch where she was sitting and looked at her face. He was very good at reading faces, had been for as long as she'd known him, and then he sat down on the step and got out the primer. She got out hers. They read for an hour in the afternoon light. He was on four-syllable words now. He'd been on four-syllable words for 3 weeks, and they were going well. That afternoon, he read 12 of them without stopping. And on the 13th, the word understanding, he sounded out each part separately, and then ran them together and looked up at her. She nodded. He'd gotten it. He looked back at the page and read it again. Faster this time. Understanding. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They just moved to the next word. Orson Finch's banking license was formally suspended 6 weeks later, when the State Commission completed its review. He did not leave the county. Men like Finch rarely left voluntarily, but the inquiry followed him, and the people who'd been afraid to say what they'd seen were somewhat less afraid now that someone had gone on the record first. Things were not resolved. Things were better than they'd been. The schoolhouse was rebuilt. Gideon used better lumber the second time, heavier and tightly joined, and he added a proper door with iron hinges and 2 large south-facing windows, exactly where Etta had drawn them in her notebook sketch all those months ago. She hung a simple painted sign above the door. No flourish, just the name of the place and the words below it, "Open to all." She stood back and looked at it. On the morning it was finished. All of them were there, Thatcher beside her. Gideon, hands on his hips, evaluating his own work with professional dissatisfaction over some joint he'd have done differently. Toby, on the step, which was wide and low and built so that children of every kind of body could manage it. Louisa and Samuel, and 2 more children who'd arrived that month. Thatcher looked at the sign. Then he looked at her. She said, "It's right," he said. Yes, that was all. The women of Sonora came to her in November. Not all of them, but enough 5 women who showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday morning while Thatcher was out at the South Field, led by a woman named Clara Holt, who ran the milliner's shop and who had, Etta recalled, been one of the women in the dry goods store the day Finch made his remarks. Clara had not laughed. She had also not spoken up. She'd stood there, holding a button display, and looking like she wished she were somewhere else. She stood on the porch now with her hat in her hands and said, "We came about the dress." Etta waited. "If there's going to be a wedding," Clara said, with the careful precision of a woman who had been rehearsing this, "you ought to have a proper dress. We'd like to help make it, if you'll let us." Etta looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" she said. Clara met her eyes. "Because we should have spoken up in that store, and because we've been watching what you've built here, all of you, and we know what this place is." She paused. "And because making a dress is something concrete we know how to do." This was not an apology that erased anything. Etta was clear-eyed enough to know that. But it was a real thing, offered plainly, without an expectation of immediate absolution, and she had enough respect for plain honesty to recognize it when she saw it. She held the door open and said, "Come in." They measured her without ceremony. Clara, who had a seamstress's instinct for the practical, approached the task with focused attention and no awkward commentary which Etta appreciated more than anything she could have said. The fabric they'd brought was cream wool, fine woven, heavier than cotton, but draping well. Clara had a pattern she'd been adapting for years in her back workroom, built for women who were not built like dress dummies, and she pinned and chalked and made notes while the others cut and hemmed and talked in the easy way of women who work together. Etta sat for the parts that required sitting and helped with the parts that didn't. She was not, she discovered, someone who could simply be still while other people worked around her. She picked up a needle and joined in. Clara looked at her stitching and raised an eyebrow. "You're good." "I've been sewing my own clothes for 12 years, Etta said. "You get competent or you wear bad things." Clara almost smiled. Then she did smile. "Fair enough. The dress took 3 weeks. They came back twice to fit it, adjusting the shoulders, letting out the skirt in stages, adding the detail at the collar that Etta had asked for simple, not fussy, a little bit of ribbon work along the edge. When it was finished, it was the most well-made thing she had ever worn. She stood in it in front of the small mirror in the bedroom and looked at herself for a while. She looked like herself. That was what she saw. Not a version of herself reduced or adjusted to fit somewhere she didn't belong. Just herself in a dress that had been built for the actual shape of her. She pressed her lips together and turned away from the mirror before she embarrassed herself. The wedding was on a Saturday in late November when the hill country had cooled enough that the air was sharp and clean and the light had that particular slant that belongs to autumn afternoons. Gideon had built a simple arch at the top of the ridge from cedar posts and pine boughs, and someone she suspected Clara had woven dried wildflowers through the branches. The ridge looked out over the whole valley. The creek caught the light in the low ground. The barn roof, rebuilt, sat solid and sure. Thatcher was already at the arch when she came up the hill. He'd made the walk up earlier, letting his ankle take the slope slowly, and he was standing there in his best clothes, which were not fancy, but were clean and pressed and clearly worn on purpose, looking out at the valley with the expression she'd learned to read, the one that was several things at once, and told the truth about all of them. He turned when he heard her on the path. He looked at her. She watched his face and did not look away from it, because his face, in that moment, was the clearest thing in her line of sight. He looked at her, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously fully, without adjustment, without the polite performance of a man making the best of a situation. He just looked at her. And what she saw in his face was something she'd been accumulating evidence for over the past 7 months, and had finally, that morning, allowed herself to call by its right name. She'd been wrong about a lot of things in her life. She was not wrong about this. He held out his hand when she reached the arch, the same way he'd held it out in the mud at Willow Creek Crossing, on the worst night of her arrival. Bare palm, steady, waiting. She took it. Thatcher had not brought a preacher, which she had expected. He'd written his own words, which she had not expected, and he read them from a folded paper in his left hand, with the care of a man who'd worked on something, until it said exactly what he meant. He said, "I spent a long time thinking. A good life was about surviving what the world did to you. I was wrong. A good life is about choosing what to build from it. You taught me that. You showed up in the mud with nothing but the truth of who you were, and you chose to stay, and you started building from the first morning, and you haven't stopped. I'm not a man who makes promises he can't keep. I promise to stand next to you as long as I'm standing at all. I promise to tell you the truth, even when it costs something. I promise to keep building." She had her own words. She'd written them in her notebook the week before, erased them, rewritten them 3 times. She spoke them from memory. She said, "I came out west to reclaim something I thought the world had taken from me. I didn't know what I'd find. I found a man who told me the truth about what I was worth before he knew me well enough to be certain. I found a place where the work mattered, and the table was set for everyone, and the steps were built to hold. I promise to do the same for you." I promise to stand with you and tell you the truth and build with you. I promise I came here for myself, and I'm staying for us, and I know the difference. Gideon was at the back of the small gathering, standing with Clara and two of the other women, and several people from town who'd made the walk-up. He wasn't someone who showed things on his face easily, but when the ring went on a plain gold band, narrow and solid, that Etta didn't know the full story of. Yet she glanced at him and saw him look once at the arch and then back at his boots, and she thought he was moved, and she thought he would never say so, and she respected both facts equally. Thatcher had told her about the ring that morning, quietly, in the cabin, before they walked up. He'd had the shrapnel extracted from his leg the previous year by the doctor in Sonora, a fragment from El Paso, small piece of iron that had been sitting in the muscle tissue for years, periodically painful, finally removed. He'd had it melted down and made into the band. She'd looked at him when he said it. He looked back at her and said, "I thought about it for a while." Seemed like the right use. She had not had words for that, and had not tried to find them. She had them a little more now. Standing on the ridge with his hand warm around hers, and the valley spread out below, and the whole ordinary, beautiful world doing its work in the November light. Toby had come up with Gideon, and he was standing very still near the cedar arch, watching everything with enormous attention. He'd brought his notebook. He wrote things down in it throughout the ceremony, words she couldn't see from where she was standing. Observations in his cramped, precise new handwriting that was getting better every week. At some point, he stopped writing and just watched. When it was over, and they were walking back down the hill, Thatcher, with his arm around her, both of them slow on the slope, his ankle, and her preference for steadiness, combining into the same careful pace, he said without preamble, I should have asked sooner. You asked when you were ready, she said. I was ready some time before I asked. She looked at him sideways. I know. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She had gotten better at making him do that. They walked down through the late afternoon light together, and the valley came up around them, and behind them, the arch stood on the ridge with its dried wildflowers bright against the cedar. And the hill country held its breath and then let it go, and everything that needed to be was. 3 years later, the porch faced west. Thatcher had extended it the previous spring, widened it, and added a section along the south wall. So there was room for the chairs and the bench and the lesson table that Etta still used on good afternoons, and so there was room for all of them to sit in the evenings, without anyone having to pull a chair inside. He'd done it over 2 weekends with Gideon's help and Etta's specifications, and he'd added nothing she hadn't asked for and left nothing she had. The ranch was larger than it had been. Not dramatically, they hadn't expanded for the sake of it, only where the expansion made sense. A second pasture opened up along the South Creek when the boundary resurvey resolved the water rights permanently in their favor, which it had, the spring after Prentice's ruling. The herd was at 63 head. The kitchen garden covered twice the ground it had in that first difficult spring. The schoolhouse was the thing most people in Sonora pointed to now when they talked about the Vance property. It had been formally recognized by the county school board the previous year, which meant Etta drew a modest salary from public funds, which meant the school was no longer dependent on what the ranch could spare in good months and bad. There were 14 children enrolled on the regular rolls and several others who came when they could, and she had one part-time assistant, a young woman named Delphine, 22, who'd grown up on a ranch 2 counties east and had come asking for work 2 springs ago and turned out to have a gift for instruction that Etta recognized immediately and made use of. Toby was 12 now. He'd moved out of the boarding house. Etta and Thatcher had arranged it with very little announcement or ceremony, the way they arranged most things, and lived in a room at the back of the schoolhouse that Gideon had built out the previous fall. He kept it clean and precise. He read everything he could find and wrote detailed observations in a series of notebooks that had overtaken the small shelf above his bed. He was not, in any formal or legal sense, adopted, but he ate at the ranch table most evenings, and he called Etta by her name, and he brought problems to Thatcher with the directness of a child who trusted the answer he'd get. He'd spoken, eventually. Not the way most people spoke, not conversation exactly, not sustained back and forth, but words, specific ones, chosen with great deliberation, deployed when a written note or a gesture wasn't sufficient for what he needed to say. He had the voice of a person who doesn't use it casually, which meant that when he used it, people listened. The first time he'd spoken in Etta's presence, he'd said one word. She'd asked him a question he couldn't answer with his notebook because both his hands were occupied with a fence post. He'd looked at her for a long moment, and then he'd said, yes. She'd kept moving. She hadn't stopped or made a moment of it. She'd learned from the way he'd made the connection to the letter M all those years ago that some things needed to be, let alone to be what they were. Later that evening, she'd sat on the porch in the wide chair and looked at the hill for a long time. Gideon had built his own house by then, properly, on the lot at the east edge of the Vance property that Thatcher had offered him the second year, and that he'd taken with the same calm directness he applied to everything. It was a good house, solid and well considered, and built to his own design, which meant it was probably the best constructed building in the county outside of the courthouse. He still ate supper at the ranch table most evenings and still managed the carpentry and ranch work with the same focused efficiency, and the three of them had developed, over 3 years, the particular ease of people who know each other's rhythms well enough that they don't have to explain themselves constantly. The school had changed the town. Etta was careful about that claim. She didn't make it grandly, and she was honest with herself about what had changed and what hadn't. Sonora was still Sonora. There were still men like the ones who'd worked for Finch and hadn't found better since. And there were still rooms she walked into where the old assessment happened behind someone's eyes before they got their expression under control. That hadn't disappeared. It didn't disappear in 3 years, or likely in 30. But the children in the school didn't grow up with the particular ignorance of children who'd never sat next to someone different from themselves in a learning space. Louisa and Samuel had been there from the beginning, and they were 12 now, and they were close in the way of children who'd spent years bent over the same books, working through the same problems. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the slow and unglamorous beginning of something that might matter more in 20 years than anything the courthouse had done. Etta believed that. She'd built her life around it. The afternoon of the harvest celebration, a ranch gathering, nothing formal, just a day at the end of October when the work was done and the year's accounting was favorable, and there was reason to sit together and eat well. She carried her daughter out to the porch. The baby was 7 months old and had her father's dark hair and her mother's way of taking in a room before committing to any expression, which was, Thatcher said, the most accurate possible combination of traits. She was solid and healthy and had opinions about things which she communicated without words and with great effectiveness. She regarded the world with a focused attention that Etta recognized. Thatcher came out from the barn and saw her on the porch and crossed the yard toward her, at the pace he always used, unhurried, steady, his left leg giving that slight pull at the end of a long day. He'd never walk without that. She'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing anything that is simply part of how a person is. He came up the steps he'd built and rebuilt, and that had never once given way since, and stood on the porch and looked at both of them. The little girl looked back at him. He took her, settling her against his arm with the practiced ease of a man who'd figured out, through trial and error over 7 months, how she preferred to be held. She seemed satisfied with this and immediately became interested in the button on his shirt collar. Etta leaned against the porch post and looked out at the valley. The late October light was the color of old honey, and the cedar on the ridge was dark against it. and the creek in the low ground caught the sun and threw it back. Gideon was coming up from the south pasture. Toby was visible at the schoolhouse door. Reading something, she could see the particular shape of his attention from here, the way he went still over a page he was working through. The ranch was full of sound, the easy sound of a late afternoon when the day's work was mostly done. Animals settling, a gate swinging, the fire in the cabin starting to tick and warm through the window glass. The sound of a place that was inhabited, loved in the particular way that you love something you have built with your own hands and chosen every day to keep building. Thatcher said, "That rainy night, you whispered that you came for me. But truth is, my sweet Etta, you brought life, dignity, and love back to this barren hill." She looked at him. His face was serious the way it was usually serious, which didn't mean what it might mean on someone else's face. On his face, it meant he was saying something he'd thought about and meant entirely. She'd come a long way from the woman who'd fallen in the mud at Willow Creek, crossing with her mother's poems scattered across a puddle. She'd come a long way from the woman who'd calculated whether she was worth a full plate of beans, who'd learned to make herself invisible in every room she entered, who'd crossed a continent hoping for minimum conditions, a place to stand upright, no more. She had more than a place to stand. She leaned into Thatcher's side, his arm coming around her, the baby between them, regarding the Texas evening with appropriate seriousness. Gideon came through the gate and gave a nod that contained its own full paragraph. Toby looked up from the schoolhouse door and lifted his hand in a wave that was surprisingly easy for a boy who'd spent so long being uncertain where to put himself. Etta lifted her hand back. The sun went down over the valley slowly, the way the best things go, not fast, not all at once, but with enough time to see it happening and understand what it is before it's past. The light went from gold to orange to the deep particular blue that preceded full dark, and the first stars came up above the ridge, and the lamp in the cabin window was already burning, set there before they came outside so the room wouldn't be dark when they went back in. She'd put it there herself. Small habit started the first week. A light in the window. She looked at the hill above the ridge, where the cedar arch still stood. She and Thatcher had left it up, the dried wildflowers long gone, but the cedar posts solid. She looked at the schoolhouse with its painted sign and its south-facing windows bright in the last light. She looked at the barn, rebuilt and better than before. She had built this, all of them had, out of a rainstorm and a lantern and a bare hand extended in the mud, out of a chair made in the night, and steps that held, and a plate filled without asking, out of a boy learning his first letters, and a woman learning harder that she was allowed to need things, out of a document in a lockbox and a cedar break, in the rain and words spoken on a ridge, with the whole valley listening. She looked at her husband and her daughter and the evening light on everything she knew. She had come for him. She had stayed for all of it. This was the place she'd been looking for. This was what it looked like when you stopped apologizing for existing and started building instead. The Texas night settled in around them, wide and dark and full of stars, and the lamp in the window held steady, and the porch steps did not creak, and there was nowhere else to be. There's something this story keeps coming back to, quietly, without making a speech about it, and it's this: the most radical thing a person can do, sometimes, is simply refuse to apologize for existing. Bernadette Higgins arrived in Texas with nothing but mud on her dress and her mother's poems in a broken valise. The world had spent 26 years telling her, in every language available to cruelty through stares, whispers, laughter, and the particular silence of people who look just slightly past you, that she was too much, too large, too inconvenient, too costly a presence for any room she walked into. And she had believed it, the way any person eventually believes something they've heard enough times. She had learned to make herself invisible in the only ways available to her. She calculated whether she deserved a full plate of food. She memorized library shelves so she wouldn't have to walk in front of patrons. She arranged her entire life around taking up as little space as possible, because she had learned that taking up space required a permission she was never going to be granted. What this story asks gently but persistently is, what happens when someone simply doesn't ask for that permission anymore? Not through grand defiance, not through a dramatic declaration, through small, daily, deliberate choices, through cooking breakfast and eating all of it, through sitting in a chair built to fit her and teaching a silent boy his first letters, through walking into a burning barn because someone she loved was inside it and discovering, in that moment, that her body, the thing she had been at war with her entire life, was capable of lifting what needed to be lifted. That scene in the barn is the heart of the story, I think. Not the romance, not the legal victory, not even the wedding on the Wildflower Hill. It's the moment when Thatcher looks at her through the smoke and says, "Your body isn't a curse. It just saved my life." Because he doesn't say it to comfort her. He says it because it's true, and he is a man who states true things plainly, without decoration, the same way he describes the pinto beans or the south fence line. He makes no distinction between facts that are convenient and facts that matter. Her worth is simply obvious to him, not earned, not conditional, not dependent on how much space she takes up, or how little she eats, or whether the room approves of her presence. And that is the rarest and most valuable thing one person can offer another. The other truth this story holds is about what it means to build something. Not just barns and schoolhouses, though those matter too. Building in the way Thatcher does it quietly, at night, without announcing the gesture, and in the way Etta does it, with her father's legal language and her mother's love of words, and her own hard-won refusal to disappear. Building in the way Gideon does it, with craft and loyalty, and the dignity of a man who insists on eating at the same table, not because he was invited, but because exclusion is simply beneath the people he chooses to work alongside. What this story gives you, if you let it, is permission. Permission to need things. Permission to eat, to take up space, to ask the hard question directly, to walk into the burning building when the person you love is inside it. Permission to build, slowly and unglamorously, the kind of life and the kind of place where everyone at the table gets a full plate and the steps are built to hold, and the lamp is always lit in the window. You don't have to earn your right to exist. That was never the actual requirement. Someone just forgot to tell you. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are products of the author's imagination and are used for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.